It's now 9:30 and time for me to open this session of the Enfield Local Plan examination. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. I know there are probably some new faces around the table today, but I'm not going to go through my long spiel that I did yesterday. There'll be a shorter opening, but there'll be an opportunity at the end of my opening. If anyone's got any queries about process or procedure who weren't here yesterday or wasn't able to watch it online, then feel free to ask. Before I do get into my main remarks, just the usual housekeeping issues about mobile phones and laptops or any other devices can be set to silent, please. I'll just ask again the council if they could just reiterate what they said yesterday about any other housekeeping matters. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's May Hope. I'm Head of Strategic Planning and Design. So it's similar to yesterday's format. We're not expecting a fire alarm test today. However, in the unlikely event that an emergency does happen, the fire alarms will sound. So can we all exit to the left, my left? Assembly points are located outside of the Civic Centre and council staff will be on hand to guide you. Toilets are located on the ground floor, accessible via the reception area. So if you require accessible facilities or additional assistance, do please speak to a member of staff or our security team outside and they will be happy to help you. We've got tea and coffee provided during the breaks and are available at the front of the room. And just a reminder that these sessions are being recorded as part of the official examination record. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please inform the programme officer, that's Mrs. Feeney, she's to the left. If there's no immediate questions, I will now hand back to the inspector to proceed with today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I went through yesterday my full role in this examination and the role of the programme officer. I don't intend to go through that again. However, as I say, there will be an opportunity to ask me any questions at the end, if need be, about my role. A reminder that the purpose of the examination is to help me decide if the plan is sound. So if the plan submitted in August 2024 is legally compliant and sound, and if not, how it could be modified to ensure that it is. This session, like the others, will take the form of a structured discussion of the matters set out on the agenda, which was published last week. And today, which is an all-day session, again, if we need it, is to discuss matter 2, which is about housing need and supply, and in particular issue 2.1, which is related to the housing requirement. As per yesterday and subsequent days, I will start each topic, issue, item by asking some questions of the council or any other parties around the table. I think it would help me. I'll do that first, and then once I've asked my questions, I will open it up to others to contribute. Again, for those who were here yesterday, you know this, but for those new, sometimes I've got quite a few questions, so it might be a while before I can bring you in, but it is better for me if I can go through everything I want to discuss before opening it up, just to make sure I get what I need, but also might circumvent some discussion later on if I've already covered it. When you do wish to speak, if you wish to speak, if you could turn your nameplate on its end, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. When I invite you to speak, certainly if you've not been here before, it'd be useful to say who you are and if appropriate who you represent, certainly in the first instance. If you could please focus your comments on the questions or specific points made. I would ask, it's not always possible, doesn't always happen, but as much as possible for each contribution to be as concise and focused as possible, to allow everyone a chance to speak if they wish to on a particular issue. One thing there is to remember is there's no need to repeat or summarise what you wrote in your representations or written statements. They are before me. Obviously, if you want to draw my attention to something in particular or remind me of that, that's perfectly fine. If you want to give me a reference that I can look at my leisure when I go away and consider the points that have been raised, then that's fine and very helpful. In raising your comments, there's never any need, However, to tell me that you agree with what somebody else said or you echo their comments, that's not necessary. So I'll just nip that in the bud before we go on. A good point is a good point, no matter how many times, and it doesn't get any better if it's repeated. Having said that, as I said yesterday, the nature of this examination, the nature of the plan and the nature of the issues we're discussing, there will inevitably be some overlap and some repetition of what we've discussed, particularly when new people arrive who weren't there previous days. I anticipate that. So, for example, yesterday we talked about paragraph 4111 of the London Plan. We're going to talk about paragraph 4111 today extensively. We're going to talk about it probably next week, at least on 2 days, I would imagine. It's sort of unavoidable, but hopefully by the time we get to next Thursday, if we get to next Thursday, the number of times we have to talk about it will have diminished substantially. One final point about, one thing is that obviously whenever it's about time to move on, I will always give the Council the opportunity to sum up their position at the end of each item on the agenda if they wish to, or have the final say. So that's one point to make. Also, that again, as I said yesterday, if don't leave the room today without saying something you want to say. If I determine that it's not relevant to today's session, I will stop you and we can pick it up at a later date. But there will be. It's not always going to be an opportunity to come back and say, oh, I wish I'd said this, I wish I'd said that. If you write to me afterwards, say, I really wish I'd said this, but I almost definitely won't accept it. So say what you want to say while we're in the room. I've been asked by, through Annette, apparently yesterday there was some sound issues now and again in terms of people, probably me as well, sitting too far away from the microphone. So if just a reminder that if you can remember to speak into the microphone. I think there's a tendency, again, inevitably you want to speak to me. And so if you're speaking to me, your head's over here necessarily. So that's not, I won't be offended if you're talking into the microphone. I know you're speaking to me. I covered conduct at the examination yesterday. We've got fewer people in the room watching today. Maybe they're all watching at home on the YouTube stream. Fascinating as it is. So I won't go over all that again, but obviously just normal etiquette applies. One person speaking at a time. Please don't speak until asked to speak, and obviously try to keep all comments respectful and civil as much as possible. As with other sessions, if I identify that main modifications might be needed, or that further work needs to be carried out by the Council or any other party, I'll usually make that clear during the session, although but the Council will and should keep a note of all those matters. I will clarify action points from the previous day during the opening session, which I'm going to do shortly. And I'll probably issue an action note at the end of the stage one. Well, I will issue an action note at the end of the stage one hearings, along with any other things which I feel need to be raised. In subsequent stages, where there are longer periods and maybe gaps, there may be action points at the end of every week, but I don't think that will be the case here. I simply won't have time to produce that as we're sitting on Friday, and I'm going to be travelling for most of the time between that. So. It's also possible, and again, given the nature of what we're talking about, very likely there are some matters that I'll need longer to think about, and I would deal with those in a later note rather than any trying to deal with any actions on a daily basis. So if, for example, at the end of today, I've not given a view on the housing requirement, then that's because I need to go away and think about that, and it's very unlikely I'm going to give a sort of definitive answer to any questions today, particularly as I said, I think most of what we're going to talk about next week is also pertains to this, so it's all interrelated. So, adjournment, so we'll probably try and have a break for around 20 minutes at around 11, if times go to lunch at 1, and then a break if we carry on. But after that, I didn't think we would yesterday, but we did. It shows my timekeeping is not great. If we carry on, then it'll be, again, break at 3:30, but it's all fluid depending on where we are in the discussions and how sensible it is to stop. So are there any queries about any of that from anybody? No? Good. before I go through the actions from yesterday and any other matters that might arise, any other housekeeping matters that the council want to draw to my attention, I think we may as well just go around the table and get introductions now, perhaps starting with the council's team. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my name is Matthew Reid. I'm King's Counsel instructed by the Council. Perhaps Mr. Anderson Frank introduces himself. I think he's not been before you until now.
Mr. Anderson Frank speaking for London Borough of Enfield. I'm a principal planner.
Ian Gillespie, planning consultant representing the London Borough of Enfield.
Can we have a microphone problem? Can somebody? Is the other microphone? There should only be one on at a time. So mine's okay, but there's no other on, is there? So. So we'll just pause a second while, because obviously if anyone is watching on the stream, they won't hear you if the microphone's not on. So.
Yeah, Richard Pestel, partner at Rapley's on behalf of London Borough of Enfield.
James Stevens, Home Builders Federation.
Neil Rowley, Savills, on behalf of Coma Homes.
Scott Hudson from Savills on behalf of New Ladders Wood LLP. New Ladders Wood LLP.
Okay, good morning, Matthew Spry from Lichfields on behalf of Berkeley.
Lakis Pavlou on behalf of the Hadley Wood Neighbourhood Planning Forum.
Carol Fisk, Enfield Road Watch, Friends of Trent Country Park, Trent Park Conservation Committee and Western Enfield Residents Association.
John West from the Enfield Society.
Vicky Pite from Enfield Over 50s Forum.
Matt Byrne from Better Homes Enfield and NCAF Land Use Working Group.
Sorry, you don't have my phone.
Is that? Okay, sorry about that. Yes, Councillor Edward Smith. I represent Ridgeway Ward, about half of which is Greenbelt.
Okay, thank you very much. As I said again, sorry to reiterate for the people who were here yesterday, unless you've been here before me, or I can literally read your sign, I may well be referring to you by your organisation name until I get to know you better, and we can. But some of you have been here before me, so I know that. Right. So before we get into the substantive points, there are some actions from yesterday I want to run through, and we can see whether we're all in agreement about what they are and the outcome, and then obviously if the council has anything else it wishes to raise, either in actions I've missed or other matters that have arisen overnight, then they can let me know. I'll just go through my points, shall I? So first things, I mean, these are in no particular order of importance or just as they came up. So firstly, I think the intention was to publish the council's hearing statement as an examination document. That can be done as soon as possible, and I'm sure Annette will give it an appropriate reference. Second issue, which is sort of encompasses a few actions, was addressing all of the issues relating to the consultation database and Regulation 20, which are, in my mind, unless I've forgotten something, ensuring all missing representations are provided to me as soon as possible. I think that there was the 4, whatever that might entail. Addressing the issues we discussed regarding the database, and that seemed to be about creating a new database, effectively what's already there, using a new system and publishing that, thus ensuring that all the representations are then available for people to view. which they currently can't. I don't just mean the 117 and everything. I mean the links to the wrong reps
Yes.
and all that, the missing, that are not available. Reissuing Regulation 22 statement, which has got a missing schedule in it, and also any updates that are necessarily needed from anything else that's comes out of this, even if you're not going to change the summaries or main issues, it may be that factually things change.
Yes.
On that, this is probably an action for Annette and myself, I suppose, in that I obviously have copies of the documents myself, so I have my own, so I don't necessarily need to use the library all the time. But I suppose, on reflection, I think if the original Reg 22 statement has been completely replaced, it might be beneficial to have, so we've got a complete audit trail, to have the original back on the website, so everyone can at least see what has changed, have the new one, and then if there is a 12.2 or something like that, we have that, so at least we can see what all that is, any changes that are taking place, and just for completeness, so there's no confusion.
Yes, of course. So, in that case, we'll, with your permission, make a series of, or have a series of the iterations, and each one of them identifiable by way of their dates.
Now, the date I was given for the database being revised, and then thus hopefully the Reg 22, the Reg 20 requirements met. As far as you're concerned, I know there's still debates over whether or not people agree with the statements, but that's a slightly different issue to making sure that the things are absolutely in place. Was 31st of March, which, okay, I will take that on board. I guess I want to make sure that if that is 30th, I want to keep that under review to make sure if it slips, I need to know rapidly. One thing I've got to do as well, I need to do, is obviously make sure that the people who have not been notified are notified, that their people have been given. Sorry, I'll just mute that. I'm breaking my own rules. Do beg your pardon. And that people have an opportunity to put in matter statements for this session, and we'll have to see where that takes us in terms of all the rectifying work. So there'll have to be a sort of programme of this that I'll need to determine. And I think, bearing in mind that I don't think this is going to be the only action coming out of these 2 weeks, I probably, I'll use this as a date now, but I think I'm going to want to sort of work out some kind of programme of works which factors in what you're doing on Reg 20, Regulation 20, Reg 22, any other documents that I feel people need time to be able to comment on outside this, such as, for example, the TfL Statement of Common Ground. If it's produced now, no one's going to have an opportunity to comment on that sensibly. If there's any other documents, any other actions, so I need to sort of work out some kind of programme. We'll come on to that in terms of what that means for the DTC statement as well. Do you want to just say something about the pragmatism, the Minister's letter on pragmatism and delays to examination? For those, obviously, who were here yesterday, you know that I am, one of the reasons we're doing stage 1 hearings as we are, and just having this 2-week session, is because I have a small window of opportunity in my work programme where we can do something, not as much as I would like to have done, and there are some very significant outstanding issues which it would have been preferable to do, but it was either do it now or do it in several months' time, so
yes.
Better to do something. So there is, if you like, an enforced delay, which works to your advantage in some respect, but I just want to make the point that if we'd have been doing, if I'd got a full 8-week programme, it's likely I would have paused to address those issues if they were going to take till March to address, because obviously it would have been more difficult to carry on going through all of the issues while still having the situation where there were people who might not be aware, or people who couldn't access representation. So if there was any, we couldn't see such and such a representation, but the matter's already gone, it makes it much more difficult to address. The fact that we've got that little bit of time to be able to rectify that is helpful. But it shouldn't be taken as, that work would need to be done anyway. And in the normal course of events, that would have been classed as a pause that falls into the scope of Mr. Pennycook's letter. And so while I will be mindful, obviously, if any further delays occur because of actions that are needed or soundness issues that need to be addressed, I'll be mindful of the fact that there was I wasn't available. I think we still need to be mindful of what the purpose of Mr. Pennycook's letter was, which is to not, keep delaying things which shouldn't be done during examination. So I think there's an element of discretion on my part about how that's interpreted, but I just don't want to think, it's carte blanche. We've got that enforced delay anyway, so it doesn't count towards anything. It's nothing. I will be sort of further delays occur. This will still be in my mind as to what has occurred, if that makes sense.
It does, sir. And yes, we're not treating it as a licence then to enable us to take further steps that might delay matters still further. Our aim, of course, is to efficiently and as effectively as possible get through the examination process.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. So you say it's all going to factor in if there are other, and obviously well, I'll come on to the other point
yes,
about it. So anything else on the what I've mentioned about in terms of actions on the representation side of things?
Not in terms of the representations. We fully understand that there will need to be a programme in place in order that we can, in order that those persons who haven't as yet been notified of the examination are notified, and that others who haven't had an opportunity to see some of the representations because of the misnaming and misnumbering of those representations have the opportunity to do so.
Thank you. So yeah, and I'll come to that and make sure we try to give everyone the chance to catch up, I suppose. So moving on then to the duty to cooperate evidence we discussed, and the need for me to see copies of the at least copies of the correspondence about housing and employment needs at the 2021 period, both what the council sent and what responses they had. Any evidence of any other engagement that took place in relation to meeting housing and employment needs, including details of any meetings where this issue was discussed, minutes, agendas if they're available, as well as the details of the meetings, the outcomes preferably as well. And this should obviously, what we talked about was anything that occurred between 2021 and submission and the signing of the statements of common ground effectively as well. I think we talked about evidence of engagement of matters relating to meeting the needs of gypsy and travellers prior to submission, and how this all relate. I think we're not reliving the discussion, but the two Regulation 18 stages, and as you said, well, the second Regulation 18 was post submission, but there was sufficient activity up to that point that didn't alter anything. So I just need some comfort on that. And then finally, I think any additional evidence or detail provided with regard to, well, any meetings that took place really about some of these issues, but particularly where concerns have been raised, i.e. from TfL, which might all be sorted through the next item on my thing, which was the copy of the TfL Statement of Common Ground, which is obviously very important document. Deadlines for that, I think you said you could have it all done by Monday. Yes. I don't quite know if there was a purpose for Monday. Whether you thought I needed to see it before we continued next week.
No, it was solely in order to get it to you as soon as possible. But okay. So if that's not something that's going to hold up the discussions for next week, then of course having more time to compile it will mean that you'll have something that is much more effective and user-friendly.
I think so. I mean, as we talked about yesterday, I'm continuing on without prejudice basis, and in theory, I could have paused things until I got that information, because there's no point carrying on if the duty's been failed. But you're convinced you can demonstrate that. I'm giving you the opportunity to do that. But if you produced it on Monday, and if I had time to read it, which is unlikely, and was aghast, then there's no opportunity to really discuss it. I'd have to stop, which would help. And also, there still might be opportunity to want other people to be able to comment on the information that's been produced. So it seems to me I'd prefer, if you're content to carry on the basis of what I said, that to do a thorough job, which leaves no sort of stone unturned, and you are satisfied that you've given me everything you possibly can to demonstrate that you've had all this engagement. We can talk about, you can give some thought to when that will be, and then I can obviously, in my post stage 1 action note, if you like, formal, we can talk about again how that fits into a programme.
Yes.
And once I've received it, whether or not I need to give people, again, the opportunity to deal with things through written reps. It may be that I want to do, obviously, some more written reps myself, might ask some questions about it, particularly, again, given that we've got this slightly enforced delay. There might be scope for some back and forth on that before we get to a hearing session. I mean, it's open, really, to me, or I might get it, be satisfied, and that'll be the end of it. But I think, given the importance of it, it's better to not rush it, I would say.
I agree, sir.
Okay.
And thank you, yes. We'll take that opportunity, and we'll wait for the programme. We'll keep, obviously, working on it in the background.
Yeah. I mean, if you can give me a rough idea of how long, at some point, once you've had a chance to discuss it, if you can give me an idea of when you think you could have it done by, then I can factor that in to everything else.
Yes, we'll do. Thank you.
So the fourth item on my list is the copy of this TfL Statement of Common Ground, which I think I'm still waiting for, which I suppose is an action, but it was an action from before sessions. The fifth item I have is there was a reference in my notes to providing me, an audit could be provided of the engagement that's taking place. It was in relation to the TfL discussions particularly, but it was about the engagement that's taken place since submission and what the likely outcomes. There's obviously reference to, we might want to make lots of changes, and the point made was that it's about the detail, not the strategy, and yes, if that's the case, then we can perhaps pick it up when we're talking about the detail. But if you recall, in my preliminary questions, I asked for there was talk then about we're doing lots of work, and it was not clear into what that work was, and I asked for sort of okay, can you just clarify what all that is? I think because of all the references to other work being done on the engagement, a similar audit would be helpful to me of where we are of things. Now, that's not to say I'm going to accept all of that evidence or I'm going to be pleased to see it or so on, but I would like to know, if you're talking to, obviously, developers or TfL about just, it's nothing to do with the examination, I don't need to know that, but if it's something which might have an influence or might have an impact on the examination or the plan, then I'd like to know what's being done. So I don't want any surprises, basically. But as I say, if you say to me, we're producing a new transport, transport model, I'm probably going to want to come back and say, well, why? Things like, we're redoing this or we're redoing that. I'm going to want to know why, and I'm going to want to know why I should be accepting it before I accept it. But if I know that it's coming, or I know what work you're doing, then at least helps me.
Yes, obviously there are lots of things going on outside of the plan-making process. And what I've taken from your request is that you want to have the information that is ongoing, or the detailed work that is ongoing, that might have the potential to come to this examination.
Yeah, if you're talking about a planning application and it's nothing to do with me,
exactly,
that's up to you. It's outside my scope. If you're talking about something where you think actually we're going to want to, this might result in the asking for a main modification or something's not sound. It could be. I'm speculating. It could be that it's all would be resolved under matters. So a matter, whatever, and you can in answering that question, as you have with some of these, we've got this. But I think again, just for me thinking about how examination is going to progress,
Yes.
being forewarned of some of this would be helpful.
Yes, certainly.
And also for other people as well. You know,
Indeed, sir. Yep. We'll make sure that's done.
Okay. The next thing on my list was again, it was more of just a avoidance of doubt thing. I think it was confirmation about the extent to the use of AI in your Reg 22 statement.
Yes, sir. I have taken instructions on that, and an investigation has been made of the officers, and I'm instructed that there was no use of AI in the summaries of the consultation responses or the responses to those consultations.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I know that was raised by someone. I'm not intent to. I know you raised it at this stage. Unless it comes up in another part of the discussion, I don't need to hear any more on that. I think. So, it is. If that's what I'm told, that's what I'm told. So
It is going to come up.
well, if it's going to come up, then it's going to fine. It can come up as a result of something else. But I'm not going to get into another debate about the Regulation 22 statement. If it's the outcome of a policy or the outcome of a conclusion, decision, that's the best place to raise it now if it's relevant to that. Okay. Next thing on my list is confirmations to whether. Oh yes, I think it was confirmation you were going to consider whether the issue of the London plan being out of date or not had been raised anywhere else, either I guess examination or in the courts.
That's right. So we've checked the case law on the situation as to whether the out-of-datedness of the London plan, or indeed any strategic plan, has an effect on the approach towards the issue of general conformity. And I'm sorry to say, or perhaps happy to say, one way or the other, there isn't any direct authority on that point, perhaps unsurprisingly. So the submissions that I made yesterday stand. I don't have any different position, at least that we're taking at the moment, and I don't anticipate that we're going to find anything that we haven't found, that we haven't not been able to find through our investigation so far.
No case law so far, isn't it?
That's right.
And finally, on my list, and it's not really an action for Enfield, it is an action for GLA, really, is the asking whether or not we could get a transcript of their statement, or sorry, a copy of their statement, not a transcript, a copy of their statement to add to the examination library as an examination document. And I believe, I'm not quite sure how this was going to be precipitated, but I think that's in hand, apparently.
So we're expecting that at midday, I think, is when it's going to be sent to the examination.
So assuming it is as discussed, as it was, what I will want actually, before that goes online, obviously I want to look at that and make sure it is as I expected it, and it's not something completely different that's been submitted before it goes on. But once it's, once I'm content, it will be put on as an examination document. Okay. That's on my list. Have you had any others that you have identified that I've missed?
No, sir, nothing else beyond those. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, okay. We'll move on then to matter 2, issue 2.1, whether the assessment of overall housing need and the housing requirement is justified, positively prepared, and consistent with national policy and in conformity with the London plan. Find my questions. So question 2.1 was, we'll start with that, is whether or not the housing requirement of at least 33,280 homes by 2021, by 2041, is justified and positively prepared, and obviously by definition consistent with national and local London plan policies. Part A of question 2.1 relates to the, obviously the requirement is split effectively into 2 tranches, up to 2029 and post 2029. So I'm going to, the way I've set out the question, I've split those issues up. So I just want to start with the requirement up to 2029. I've got a few questions about that, and then I will open that up before moving on to the post. So we keep things nicely compartmentalised. So the London Plan identifies a 10-year requirement of 12,460 dwellings for Enfield between 2019 and 2029. Is that correct? Yeah. And according to Table 2.2, that's made up of completions. In terms of how you've identified that in the plan, it's made up of completions between 2019 and 2022. We'll come on to that because I know that's something you might want to update. 1,226 dwellings per annum plus a 20% buffer from 2022 to 2027, and then 2,091 dwellings per annum between 2027 and 2029, and that includes the undersupply or under delivery from years 2019 to 2022. If I've understood that correctly, you can confirm that, and I'll come back to those components shortly. But just for completeness and the avoidance of any doubt, as far as, and obviously I raise this question, so if anybody in the room does want to challenge this, they can, is there any suggestion that for the period between 2019 and 2029, any figure other than that set out in Policy H1 and the associated table should be used? I.e., in particular, as any national policy, or for example, being published since the adoption of the London Plan, which would suggest diverging from Policy H1?
So just...
Forgive me, sir.
I think that it's probably going to be something that Mr. Anderson-Frank will deal with in more detail. But insofar as we're looking into the position to 2029, we've followed the approach set out within the London Plan. We don't think that there is a need to divert from that.
Okay. And
anything you want to say?
And in the context, we had a bit of a discussion yesterday. There's a couple of questions about this later, about whether the London Plan is out. It's a sort of continuation of the theme, really. Is the London Plan, any suggestion that the London Plan should be deemed out of date in the context of that policy?
Well, so obviously things have changed and are changing. With regard to whether the policy is out of date, it certainly has the capacity to be looked at in that way, in the light of the changes. And indeed, the GLA itself is recognising that a different approach is now required in the light of what the MPPF states. So it's certainly open to reach that conclusion. If that conclusion is being reached, it's going to be a conclusion that ultimately would increase the level of need for London significantly. So to that extent, our approach up to 2029 is one that is reflecting, obviously, the London Plan position, but can be regarded as cautionary, if anything.
But in terms of, just to be clear, in terms of what the, so we have the transitional arrangements. I'm examining the plan of the 2023 framework. There's nothing in that which suggests that you shouldn't be using the figure in H1.
No, there's nothing directly to suggest through the transitional provisions, but of course the transitional provisions don't say that you are excluded from considering any of the rest of the context within which a plan is to be considered. And the context, of course, is, as I said yesterday, the context is that we are looking at a plan to 2041, which is seeking to make provisions for sustainable sites in part that are going to extend beyond the plan period. And for those reasons, it's right to acknowledge the direction of travel that the provision of housing in London is going to take under the revised provisions of the NPPF. So the existence of the transitional provisions, whilst they require the testing of soundness against the terms of the December 23 NPPF, they don't preclude the taking into account of that future context.
But I meant to take it, I understand the council has, up to now, obviously there was nothing, before December 2024, there was no other alternative, if you like. So you've come up with a requirement based on policy H1, at least to 2029. Are you then saying that you should abandon that and use the standard methodology?
No, we're not saying that. We've taken the approach of adopting the terms of the MPPF as it was at December 23. And that produces the figure set out within H1. But when one's reaching the conclusion as to the appropriateness of the overarching approach that we've adopted, including the position post 2029, it cannot be assessed in isolation of those changes.
Okay.
So when one's reaching a conclusion as to whether or not, for example, the housing figure is positively prepared, one would take into account the fact that as an inevitability, there will be an enhanced level of need in the future.
Okay. Right, okay.
And to give you some comfort, though, sir, doesn't mean that one changes the approach that we have adopted, which is to follow the London plan in the way that we have. But what it means is that to the extent that it's suggested that there should be a constrained figure beyond that which we've provided, it's counterbalanced by the fact that for the future, the position is going to be significantly changed.
Okay, see what people have to say about that. Just want to go through the components of the figure up to 2029 then. So first element of completions, your hearing statement and answer to PQ24 refer to updated figures up to 2024, presumably up to April 2024. And there's been an increase in the, however you want to call it, backlog under supply. And as I understand it, policy SS1, table 2.2, proposed to deliver that backlog by 2029. So it would be so everything that you're supposed to deliver so the requirement is 12,460 and you will deliver 12,460. Is that correct? And has that position changed now?
That was the original intention, sir. But I think the London plan has been demonstrated to have been overtaken by events, including those London plan targets. And we now no longer think it would be realistic to deliver that backlog of 2,500 homes in the next 5 years. Because for one thing, we would be required to show that as deliverable supply, which would be very difficult because there are quite stringent requirements to demonstrate that sites are deliverable under the NPPF. And that would entail not just our London plan target of 1,246 dwellings per annum, which is higher than what we're currently achieving. It would entail 500 dwellings in addition to that per annum, i.e. around 1,750 dwellings per annum. And we don't think that that would be a realistic and deliverable sort of approach, just taking into account what we have in our committed supply. And as you know, we've updated our 5-year housing land supply. We've published that and given that to you, sir. And we can show through that it would be very unlikely that we could identify additional sites through this process, through this examination, that could realistically deliver additional capacity prior to 2029, which is now in almost just 4 and a bit years.
So you say in your matter statement, I think that, I suppose the simple question is, so if you're not delivering, or something you're putting to me that you can't deliver 12,460 in the up to 2029, then what does the requirement then become up to 2029? Because if your 5-year supply, based on your approach in table 2.2, your 5-year supply figure will always be based on the stage you are in that list. So at the moment, your 5-year supply figure will be based on 12,460. Now, it seems to me in your hearing statement, you said, well, it won't change the requirement up to 2029, which I found a little bit confusing, because if you're not delivering 12, your requirement as it stands is based on delivering the backlog. If you're not delivering the backlog, then your requirement's not going to be 12,460. Or if your requirement is 12,460, you're automatically not going to be able to meet it. So you're in a sticky position.
That's correct, sir. I think we are requesting you to consider a step trajectory through this process that would allow us to demonstrate the required 5-year housing land supply at adoption. So it is recognized that I think there's a sort of a terminology point here about requirement, but agreed that the individual years, the requirement that will be set through the step trajectory, the sum of those will not be 12,460.
No. So the requirement then, if you're redoing table 2.2 in this new form, and there are other things that are coming out of table 2.2, I imagine this will be another action point where I need a revised, a suggested main modification, whether or not I agree with it, etc., is going to come. But there might also be the scope. People are going to have to, when I be able to comment on this, because obviously no one's had a chance to look at it. Is that the requirement up to 2020 would no longer be 12,460, would it? So
that's correct, sir.
So how does that then? So we're in a conversation about, well, we're adhering to the London plan by having a requirement of 12,460 up to 2029, and then I'm being told, well, we're not actually. So how does that? How am I supposed to proceed on the basis of how you're in conformity with the London plan if you're not delivering 12,460?
Well, I think it's just a case of when the backlog is addressed, and we just simply don't think it would be realistic to put before you a trajectory which suggests it is realistic to address that backlog in the next less than 5 years. So necessarily, yes, we're absolutely requesting a lower figure in the period 2019 to 2029. And we think that that reflects the previous government's review of the London Plan, for example, and other evidence. I think I did a quick calculation, which is that although the London Borough of Enfield in the last 5 years has delivered only 60% of the housing requirement it set out in the London Plan, the average across London is 65%. So we're not actually very far off the London-wide situation. So I think it's just genuinely reflecting the kind of market conditions and other events that have frankly overtaken the London Plan and have shown London to significantly under-deliver against the housing requirements set out in the London Plan.
Okay. So what is, sorry, what actually is going to be the requirement? I mean, I understand that in the terms of looking at the plan period as a whole, a portion of that overall requirement is 12,460, which contributes to meeting what the London Plan expects you to deliver for a period. But clearly, so yes, but unfortunately, at least for now, the London Plan gives you a figure up to 2029, and then we've got a whole other debate what happens after 2029. So we have this kind of, might be somewhat artificial distinction, but it is a distinction that the London Plan establishes, and something I have to consider in terms of, obviously, overall delivery, conformity with the London Plan, etc., etc. So is there actually a figure now which you are saying, albeit we'll have to come on to, and this is a slight annoyance or unfortunate nature of not being able to necessarily get into the nitty-gritty of the 5-year supply and the supply figures in this stage, it gives me something to work to, and I know what we're going to work to, but is there a revised, well, actually, the technical requirement for 2029 is X now, so I know what that's likely to be.
I can just give you an indicative figure, if that's all right, which is around...
I prefer a non-indicative figure. I prefer an actual figure, but yeah.
Well, it's around 9,250.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so that's quite a significant reduction then in terms of what you're expecting to be able to deliver during. So, just in basic practical terms, in relation to policy H1 of the London Plan, if I were to conclude that what you're saying is absolutely correct and everything else. Is the Enfield plan, would the Enfield plan be in conformity with the...
We believe it is still in general conformity. It's around 74% of the requirement, which is in line with our recent housing delivery test performance. So,
Okay. One of many bombshells that are being dropped. Because obviously, as you're saying, this statement says it won't affect the requirement, but it technically must, in my view. Okay, there may well, and I say this is probably step one in a few steps of how we're going to get to the bottom of this. But I'm sure there'll be some comment. Other aspects of the... so I've got to obviously come to a view about the shortfall issue at some point, and how that's delivered, Sedgefield, Liverpool, some variation on that. Sorry, for people who are not in the know, that's a terms in relation to 5-year supply. I'm not going to go into what they are at the moment, but... so we've got that. So completions would need to be updated to see what they are. The other figures would need to be updated to see, and again, I'm not saying I'm accepting this, but I would need to see what the implications are. I need to see how it would work as a suggested modification. The basis of what you're saying, I guess, is that the plan isn't sound because it's not actually deliverable, so it needs to be a change. Into the second part, though, the 2022 to 23, 26, 27, I accept you might want to change some of these numbers, but it's 1226 dwellings per annum plus 20% buffer. Now, the 20% buffer is presumably reference to the delivery buffer, the undersupply that you're supposed to, so you add 20% to your supply figure, your 5-year supply figure to address under delivery. There's two things on this. From my maths, which might be wrong, those figures don't include the 20% buffer. That's it adds up to 12,460 without the 20%. So that's one thing. So it's not in. So the plus 20% is not in there at the moment, which I think is correct because the 20% buffer is not a requirement figure. The 20% buffer is purely supply. So your requirement doesn't change because of the 20% buffer. It's your supply has to reflect that, but the requirement's always the same. And I think it's potentially slightly misleading, perhaps, to refer to the 20% buffer in the requirement table because actually it's giving the impression that the requirement has to rise by 20% and it doesn't. Is that a fair point?
yes, sir, it's certainly very confusing.
Yeah. So I think, if nothing else, that would need to change. Whether or not your supply figures have to require a 20% buffer, and not least, of course, whether or not they should require the 20% buffer is purely based on the situation at the time you're assessing the 5-year supply. So it's not set in the local plan, it's something you do as and when you're assessing it. So my suggestion would be, if and when I see a suggested revised policy SS1 table 2.0, that's removed. Again, obviously, if anybody disagrees with that around the table, then I look straight to the HBF in those respects. Disagree with me. Can I just get some clarity as well on this? There's a sort of specific reference in your hearing statement to Coliseum Retail Park. It's kind of, I suppose, the focus on that one particular scheme, just for clarity, really, why you focused on that and what the relevance is to this part of the equation.
Sir, the scheme is a major site allocation which recently lapsed the planning permission to our great regret. And it obviously does kind of undermine the land supply, including the deliverable land supply in the plan. So it was felt that for full transparency, we would just remark upon that. And we are working with the site promoter to consider a revised master plan for the site. It may well be that there remains some housing capacity on the site subject to other factors, such as employment land, but it's still to be determined.
But that's something I'd pick up alongside any other deliverable site assessments as and when we get to it.
Indeed, we consider it a matter for the supply part of the hearing.
Okay. Okay. And then the 27, 28, 28, 29 figure is again, 1220, it's effectively what's left, isn't it, to get you to 12,460 in this table. I guess, again, if you want to put forward an alternative trajectory to me, then that needs to be factored in. I'll just pause now to talk about, I want to talk about post-2029 figure separately. So I will just ask if anyone's got any points they wish to raise about well, point A in my questions about the 2029 figures, or anything you've just heard, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, sir. That was a bit of a bombshell for us, I think. In regards to what we have in front of us, we felt there was a lack of clarity regarding supply sources. So it's unclear which sites are actually contributing and to which extent, and that means we can't work back very precisely to see if it's soundly based and positively prepared or consistent with policy H1. Because to find consistency with policy H1, you actually need to understand the sites and the extent to which those sites are contributing in order to make sure they're optimised. There's the issue of small sites, which we spoke about briefly yesterday, and I don't want to kind of replay that, but we did...
Well, sorry, the small sites issue will be coming on. I mean, there might be an issue, but it's also about the capacity question in 4.111.
This is in well, it is in there as well, and it's in here too because it's part of the 10-year housing supply. So in 10 years they have to achieve 3,530 homes via small sites, and so those should appear in the calculations. Now, I mean, the way that's been set out makes it quite complicated to get to the bottom of this, but we spent quite a considerable amount of time looking at this, working through the HELA HOU1 Table 7 borough housing target versus the housing trajectory and the housing topic paper, Table 13 and Figure 3.1, as well as various other bits of information. The Enfield housing supply report, which has not been published for examination. And by our estimates, the small sites figures are out, but considerably out, by around nearly 2,000 homes when we work through those figures. So we appreciate there's some clarity coming on that, but we just wanted to make a note here of the scale of what we think is which we see as miscalculation at this stage, based on the information we can see. And as I say, it is quite complex to get to this due to a lack of clarity. In terms of meeting H1 as far as we can see and make estimates of the sites which are going into there, by looking at the site allocations, you can get a kind of idea. It seems to us, and we'll deal with this, I know, but in terms of compliance with H1, which I think we're talking about here up to 2029, there is a under-optimisation, in our view, of brownfield sites. The minimums are, so we recognise the need for minimums completely. We understand why they're there, but they're set too low. I mean, even lower than existing permissions are given, which seems unusual to us. And then when we look at the schemes that have started but have not yet completed, there seems to be quite a gap between what the council says in its latest housing statement, which is not sent to the examination, and what it says in the plan, i.e. there seems to be a lot more houses yet to be completed on started sites, such as Alma and Ladderswood and so on, than have been accounted for in the plan. There's also the issue then, H1 requires all sort of suitable and available brownfield sites to be allocated, and you will see in our hearing statements we've identified a number of very clear sites which are ready to be developed, and have simply not been allocated. And I know you don't want to talk about unallocated sites, do understand that, but in terms of policy H1, it does require us to at least recognise that we can identify specifically land that has been identified by the council in other settings as being able to deliver hundreds of homes, but are then not identified within this plan. Then we move on to another bit of meeting H1, policy H1 of a London plan. And I think this is a sort of important point which will run through again throughout the examination, but it's H1B2F, which is to do with the approach that boroughs should take in terms of the optimisation of industrial land in regards to housing. And there is an interesting, I'm trying to find it here, policy in terms of how that is meant to be addressed. 6.4.8 of the London Plan, I think it is. Sorry, I've just lost it here. Bear with me 1 second while I find it. Essentially, what that policy note says, and it comes under E4 in the London Plan, is that where boroughs are seeking to allocate greenbelt land in line with policy G2, they must look to industrial land, even that in active employment use. Now, we recognise that Enfield has done that in terms of Meridian Water and the hinterlands, but to us there are very obvious other sites where the council should have deployed the same methodology before looking at that greenbelt land. And I guess that will come up tomorrow as well, I think, in terms of what the IIA assessment.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking more about the greenbelt discussion.
It will come up again another time, but I think it may come up a few times. So it is 6.4.8 under policy E4, which is the important one. And it's, for example, to give you an example of the sites where this could have been deployed in the same way as it was in Meridian Water, is CFS 149, which was up for delivering 4,000 homes, and as we understand it, also increased employment capacity. So it's really important to understand that in terms of H1.
But some of this is relevant to both. It's the whole picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because some of this, I would imagine, without looking in any detail, but some of these aren't going to be deliverable in the first 5 years or even 10 years. Perhaps they're going to be. Some of this capacity is going to be post 2029. So I think what you took, by all means, raise it now. But I think the point is a broader one about when the council has identified its. Sorry, I'm trying to summarise what you're saying. Trying to and make sure I've understood it correctly. When the council has determined what its capacity is overall, it has underestimated what it can deliver within existing opportunities without going into the greenbelt. And I think
correct.
There are some other questions I've got about that, I imagine, later on. But I just want to, so it isn't purely about, it's connected to the pre-2029, but it seems it's also about, that's not about necessarily the requirement in 2029, up to 2029, because the requirement is, as per the London Plan, 12460, the council is saying that they can't deliver that now, in which case that might affect the technical requirement to 2029. And you're saying, well, actually, they might be able to deliver more. Fine. There'll be a point at which we, in the sort of logic gates of how this examination is going to work, once we've moved through one, once I'm satisfied myself about certain things, we can move on to the next stage and talk about that in more detail. And we'll look through the figures and we'll look through the issues. But but the requirement is 12460.
Yeah.
How the delivery affects that requirement is something I need to. We've obviously talked about a little bit there, but we need to come to. But the other thing I think I'm right in saying, unless the council correct me if I'm wrong, whether or not the part of that 12460 gets pushed forward or back, which way you look at it, it doesn't affect the overall requirement to 2041. That's still the same. They're expected to deliver more in the back end of the plan, and that's what I've got to consider whether that's a justified approach. So I think all of what you're saying is sort of relevant, but it doesn't alter the actual what the London Plan says and what they're supposed to what they're supposed to deliver.
Yeah.
So I think some of that is probably we can just put a pin in.
Okay, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think where we're coming from is looking at the question where it says about compliance with H1 and then working through the various bits of H1 and saying, well, up to 2029, has it done this? No, we can't see that it has. Has it done this? No, we can't see that it hasn't. And I completely accept what you're saying about this will, for example, CFS 149 may cross over and may not be deliverable within the 2029 framework, and it's a sort of longer period is absolutely right. And so I think ultimately what we're saying is it's difficult without seeing the actual figures, but we are concerned about how these figures have been put together in terms of particularly the approach to some of the brownfield sites.
Thank you. Sorry, Hadley Wood.
Yeah, just to make sure I'm reading this right, the statement says the council could deliver the 12460 up to 29. Are you now saying that's not the case?
Well, questions through me, but the council can correct me if I'm wrong. I think that is what they're saying. Yeah, they can't deliver 12,460 by 2029. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
That's why we're seeking a step trajectory.
And when did you suddenly discover that you weren't able, between this statement and today, that you weren't going to deliver, and you're not even near delivering, you're 3,200 short? Does that just come...
Well, I think if we can I understand it's difficult. I think rather than ask questions, because obviously I ask questions, and questions through me, if you make your point, which I think is the case of your concern is that there's been a change in circumstance and how has that come about, or that's more the point, rather than asking the council to justify that. The council will come back on that if you raise your concern. Your concern is that something has changed significantly since August, I guess, when the plan was submitted. It would be, yes, I accept it would be helpful to understand how that has been precipitated. One assumes it's because there are annual monitoring reports carried out, and this year's annual monitoring report and monitoring report work has identified something significantly different. But they'll confirm that. But I'll get Councillor Smith's comments first.
Oh, right, thank you. Thank you. Yes, obviously this latest information this morning is a bombshell, as I think somebody described it as. Our view is quite simple, really, in terms of the up to 2029, is that the London Plan targets for Enfield are sensible, and we support the figure of 1,246 dwellings per annum. Apart from the fact that clearly from the evidence that's not achievable, because the actual delivery has been considerably less than that every year for the last 4 or 5 years. So that's just a statement of fact, really. But we are, I'm personally delighted that some light has been shed, some realism has been shed on some of these figures. The second point I'd like to make is because there have been some references to the London Plan being out of date, and that tends to be on the basis that housing need is going up across London, and it's going up in Enfield very substantially. Our view is that that is a misrepresentation of the processes in the London Plan for establishing housing target figures. If you look at the housing target figures that came out with the current London Plan, it is obvious that Enfield is, I think, the 10th lowest in terms of target, even though Enfield has one of the highest housing requirements. And the answer to that, as is set out very clearly in the London Plan, is that housing need and housing capacity are not in the same place as often as not. And that's why places like Barnet and Croydon have much higher targets, because presumably they have more capacity to provide housing. So saying things are out of date is, how can I put it, a misrepresentation, I suppose, of the process in the London Plan. We will talk about this in more detail in the second tranche, because the way in which housing targets are proposed to be set is set out very clearly in the London Plan, and it is completely different from the approach, and in fact it's a different approach than the one that the council has taken to come up with these very huge figures for the next 10 years after 2029.
Okay, you are taking us into the next territory, so I'll stop you there.
Yep.
Thank you. Does the council, the council do wish to come back on some of those points?
Just briefly, if I may, sir, and it's obviously straying into the territory of housing supply, but I think one of the reasons that we've highlighted the lapse of the Coliseum Retail Park planning permission is to highlight the challenges around brownfield site delivery of former employment land. The lapse of the permission came as a great surprise to the council. We had worked diligently to develop a deliverable scheme through the planning permission. It was a hybrid planning permission, including a detailed element and an outline element. And the very fact of that lapse, for one thing, it suggests that the average lapse rate in Enfield might be higher, some 18% versus the 5% we've included in the plan, which could necessitate a greater buffer in the land supply to be calculated. But just to put attention on that issue of whether we could have identified further kind of brownfield supply. And that we feel that that lapse is really indicative of the wider picture in Enfield.
Okay, thank you. To the point about why, what has changed since the submission of the plan? Is it due to more up-to-date monitoring?
Absolutely. It is annual monitoring reports, of course, sir, and engagement with developers. I think one of the factors, just talking about the kind of wider context, has been the change in fire safety rules, and that has led to some very significant delays in the phasing of permissions, many schemes having to be reconsented, a completely abnormal situation in terms of not lapse rates, but rates of re-permission, because all of our tall buildings are having to be redesigned with dual staircases, and the final confirmation of the height of the buildings where that would be impacting on the design, I believe was only in March of 2024, confirming that any building above 18 meters would require 2 staircases, and that has had a very significant impact on the phasing of our large schemes in Enfield.
So obviously, Mr. Burns raised a number of points about questions of supply, and we'll just park those if we can for present purposes. Obviously, we'll come to that later on in the process.
Yes, I mean, it's going to come up in. It's going to come up many times. So there is an issue which we can address next week. Might be the best time to do it, is the question of when releasing Greenbelt, have you considered all alternative options?
Exactly.
It clearly, again, it's this overlap issue. Clearly, it also pertains to this general point about capacity and so on. But this is where I think, this is one of those things I was talking about. There's lots of different threads that I need to bring together to come to a conclusion on the acceptability of this number.
Absolutely. So we were planning that we were going to be dealing with those alternative scenarios, if I can put it like that, i.e. what more could have been done and where it should have been done next week when we come to the exceptional circumstances element. That's where they really come under matter 4.
Okay. As long as it's picked up, Mr. Byrne. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, just one very quick point. One of the issues that we have with dealing with this is the access to information. So the annual monitoring report, as far as we can see, it hasn't been updated for quite a while. And so what's in front of us is actually very, very hard to unpick in terms of understanding this. So we would make a request that we have up-to-date information which enables us to look at this properly and to scrutinise the figures properly, because currently it's limited. We need better information. I
mean, once I come to the delivery side of the equation, we look at the supply side and in detail, then I will, as part of my matters issues, will be a completely up-to-date trajectory with the detail, so we can go through line by line, if necessary, what's being proposed as being deliverable. Obviously, that's primarily about 5-year supply. There is a side issue here, which is obviously because we're talking about a capacity-based assessment for your requirement, then I'll probably need to go beyond that to understand the entirety of that and being able to discuss it. And I think the time constraints we've got now won't allow me to do that and properly. Obviously concerns are going to be raised about those things. I'll bear those in mind when I'm coming to write my matters questions and what I want to get out of that. I say it's slightly unfortunate because ideally I would have done that now, but not now. I would have done it during this period. But I think we can ventilate, if I may use that word, ventilate these issues to understand what I'm going to need to know to be satisfied. And that's why I think, well, come on, I'm going to move on, unless you've got something to say about what you've just said. I'm going to move on to B and C. B, C and D are all effectively the same thing about whether whether the approach to post-2029 is valid. Yes. And one of the things obviously I want to understand by the end of this is A, obviously, is adhering to 4.111, the correct approach in general terms. There's a debate to be had about that, maybe. Two, if it is, then have you gone about it in the correct way? And one aspect of that, if you like, C, is that, as part of that analysis of additional capacity, whether or not Greenbelt release is in and of itself out of bounds, if you like, by the concept of what the London Plan says. Is it completely out of bounds? And if it is, that obviously will take me down one avenue for future examination. If I come to that conclusion, if I conclude that it isn't out of bounds completely, then we get into then it might depend on the sites, and then and now it takes us down another path, and then there might be, actually, I need to see everything in the round because it's inconclusive based on what I've heard so far. Hopefully not that, but you never know. Does that sort of make sense for how I think this sort of next part of the discussion will go?
I'm sorry, sir.
Sorry.
Sorry, yes, we were anticipating dealing with it from the point of view of principle as to whether or not we're able to take the approach that we have taken under 4111.
Yeah, and then some of the detail, I'll understand that when we get into what is the capacity, and this will flow into the exceptional circumstances in principle, might flow into the exceptional circumstances in detail, so on. We know we've got that exercise to do in some detail. So is that all sensible? So,
thank you for our part. Yes, thank you very much.
Right, so we'll move on then to 2.1b and C and probably D. All take them together. And this does relate to the post-2029 requirement figure, and whether this is consistent with London Plan policy and obviously whether or not in line with national policy as a direct result. The housing topic paper sets out the methodology used. The figure for the post-29 period, according to the submitted table 2.2, equates that to 20,820 dwellings. I think I'm right in saying. And as was discussed yesterday, the council's argued, and it's set out in the policy, that you've based that on the 4.111 approach set out in the London Plan. One assumes, based on what I've just heard, that the post-2029 figure will change. I say will, as in what you'll suggest to me. I say all this without, again, it's understood, I say this without prejudice. Going over a little old ground from yesterday, but paragraph 4.111 does state the following. It should be very familiar to everybody, but I'll say it anyway. If a target is needed beyond the 10-year period, which I think we can safely say it is, boroughs should draw on the 2017 SHLAR findings, which cover the period to 2041, any local evidence of identified capacity in consultation with GLA, and should take into account any additional capacity that could be delivered as a result of any committed transport infrastructure improvements, and roll forward the housing capacity assumptions applied in the London Plan for small sites. So that's the context of that. First things first, I just want to talk about the principle of the approach. Again, we may have touched on some of this yesterday, which I apologise, and then we'll come on to the components later. So the principle, given what you said in your responses to me, conformity topic paper, statement, same to common ground, and in discussion yesterday, you've made the point that as far as you're concerned, and there was perhaps a divergence of opinion between yourselves and the GLA about this, but it's not, 4.111 is not in policy. It's not, so thus it's not part, as far as you're concerned, part of the development plan. And therefore, I suppose my question is, therefore, if that is the case, is utilising that policy, falling into trap paragraph, the correct approach?
We think so. We think so, because whilst it's not part of the policy for the purposes of determining whether we have general conformity, it is nevertheless guidance indicating what the GLA or the Mayor would want councils to take as an approach.
So just on the conformity issue.
Yes.
Sorry, would you?
I was just
sorry,
about to say
beg
that.
your
So
pardon,
just
beg your
one
pardon.
other point, which is that it's not actually preclusive of any other approach. It says that they should draw on those elements, but doesn't say that that is all that should be taken into account.
Okay.
So it is conceivable for councils within the strategy area to take an additional or potentially even a different set of factors into account when reaching a conclusion as to what the requirements should be for the post-29 period.
Okay, well, that may preempt some of what I was going to ask, but I'll just come on to it. So, just on the conformity issue, and again, I apologise for picking this up, my impression of the GLA view was that, as far as they're concerned, we'll probably come on to the whole what's consultation mean, but in terms of principle, they considered meeting 4.111 as a conformity issue. You take the view that it isn't necessarily,
No.
but is it not logical, being devil's advocate, is it not logical that if that is the only guidance that's in town, that's the only guidance that exists, then that should be a conformity issue?
Well, I can certainly see the force of that sort of logical conclusion, but what that doesn't take into account is the terminology that one needs to apply, which is set out in our conformity paper. The terminology that applies by way of the 1999 Act and the 2004 Act, which requires there to be conformity with the policies of the strategy. And so it does require an assessment as to what is a policy. And of course, a whole line of case law that deals with the distinction to be drawn between written statements within a document and what constitutes the policies of a plan. And the policies of the plan are clear on the face of the London plan. It's H1, it's not the written guidance to it. And to the extent that written guidance seeks to add policy, that would necessarily be in contravention of a policy that doesn't itself make any reference to the terminology that's set out in the written statement.
Okay.
So when one looks at the terminology itself, that logical approach of saying, well, if it's the only thing that's available, then surely that is part of the policy, that doesn't overcome the purely linguistic requirements that one needs to apply when considering conformity under the Acts.
Yes. A note to Enfield as we go through this that I'm a bit of a stickler for things which are in RJ or reason justification that should be in policy, so we'll just bear in mind.
Yeah, I know, it may that same representation that I've made to you may come back to bite me. I fully accept that.
Okay, where am I? Yes, okay, that. You've kind of picked up on this, but I think it was in the context of how you might interpret 4.111 in terms of what would go into it. But in terms of it's conceivable that a local authority could diverge from that. Is it also, in effect, are you obliged as a local authority to use 4.111?
No, sir, I don't think you are obliged. And not only because it's guidance and so one can take a different approach in any event, but there may be, when one looks at 4.111, there is on the face of it the ability to add in further approaches or take a different one, simply because it's not written in a preclusive way. Now that said, of course, one needs to acknowledge that 4.111 exists, and there'd have to be some justification for taking some different approach from that which is set out in 4.111. As I say, we've sought to do so in an appropriate way, and to the extent that there are other supervening factors, for example, what we can see is the actual housing need aside from the London plan figures. that would indicate a still higher figure, it's right to have regard to that as part of the context, but not something that we've sought to apply directly for the purposes of getting to a housing requirement post-29.
Yeah, because I want to get to I want to, at least for my benefit, understand what is the correct, as correct an approach as you can be. It might be no one way of doing it, but that if the plan is silent, as in if the policy is silent on something, then is there an argument for saying, well, actually, you should revert to the framework?
There is an argument to that effect if it were silent. I mean, the policy is silent, but the plan isn't silent.
So it carries enough weight as far as you're concerned
Exactly
to give you the comfort, give me, I guess, the comfort that it's the correct approach.
Well, quite so. So we of course proceeded on the basis that what we wanted to achieve was a sound plan, and there would have to be some further justification to go beyond 4111 in circumstances where it exists and indicates the approach that authorities can take. And there was just simply no reason for taking a different approach, given the way that one can appropriately interpret the scope of 4111.
Okay. I mean, that is the question, obviously. So if anyone's got a different view on that, but the question is it a sound approach to go down that route?
Yes.
Even if there are other sound approaches, that's not necessarily an issue.
No.
It's whether or not it becomes illegitimate to go down that route because there is nothing in policy. But
Quite, and we think that the only sensible approach is one that, or rather, the most justifiable approach is one that follows 4111 rather than runs against it.
Was it now? It might just a matter of clarity in the regulation 18 consultation. I may have just misunderstood it, but was the intention to roll over? Was that the intention to roll over the London Plan figures at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
So So you presumably thought at the time the London Plan was in existence. You thought rolling over the London Plan figures was a legitimate way of doing things. So what actually changed?
Further analysis and advice.
Advice from?
Legal advice.
Legal advice, right. I.e. that it would not have been appropriate to continue with the rolling over?
Well, so I think it would be right to say that the legal advice was provided was obviously confidential.
Okay.
So I need to take instructions if I'm going to go broader than that. I mean, the simple question is, for the purposes of the examination, is whether or not the approach that's been adopted is one that is sound under the MPPF.
Yep,
and for that reason, we haven't determined it necessary to start to go down the route of explaining why changes had been made.
Well, you understand why I've asked the question. It's been put to me that there's been a change in approach.
Yeah, and one of the, I should say, there is another factor, but it's not simply, and I'm being reminded of it, and quite rightly, it wasn't simply a question of advice. It was also that there were representations by the GLA with regard to the appropriateness of simply rolling over. Yes, I know. And so, obviously, that was important and necessary for us to take into account when considering how we were going to bring forward a sound plan.
Okay. If you wait long enough, everything just comes back.
Exactly. So when one starts to go back over that process, it becomes really very complicated to set out an entirety of the factors that would led one to a particular approach. The important question, as I say, is whether the approach now is one which is sound against the relevant policies.
Okay, point taken. Yeah, I think it is whether the plan is sound. So I'm not examining something which is not before me, but I think
Exactly
I just
so.
wanted to address a point that had been raised with me.
I absolutely can understand that, the relevance of it.
I mean, this is possibly the same point really, and it's almost more of an interest point for me rather than a necessarily, because I say it's whether or not what you're telling me is sound, but it's whether we know, and colleagues around the table who perhaps have been in other examinations in London boroughs would know better, is whether or not 4111 has been effectively found sound, or alternatively unsound for any way in any other London plan as a material consideration.
I think Mr. President will
Okay.
deal with that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We have had a hunt around because, as you'll be aware, the GLA only changed its advice very recently to a roll-on. And basically, I think there's an inconsistency in adopted plans and the way that they've approached 4111. And to give you two examples, which were both adopted in 2013. So the Wandsworth plan notes paragraph 2.103 that they followed a 4111 approach.
You say 2013, you mean 2023?
2023, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to...
Apologies. They at paragraph 2.103 note that they followed 4111, but then Islington, which is also a 23 plan, they adopt a roll-on approach, but with a footnote confirming that that will be reviewed before 29. So it was quite clear that there was a lot of uncertainty about a roll-on approach, and it was essentially parked. So they're two plans in the same year that took different opinions. Just turning to emerging plans briefly, there's a Regulation 19 Croydon plan, which follows 4111, and I think it's one of those that the GLA discussed in passing yesterday, that they are aware of 4111 having unintended consequences and a cliff edge when applied. So they have a cliff edge. And then to add more into the mix, we've got the City of London plan, which is progressing on full standard method. So essentially, we don't have any consistency, and I think part of the reason we don't have any consistency is because the GLA in its various representations and advice has itself not been consistent. As we've said here, Regulation 18, the GLA very explicitly in their consultation response to us of I think it's the 13th of September, they very explicitly request that we don't use roll-on and we use 4111. So we have had an ongoing debate. And of course, as you'll be aware, we only found out about the roll-on approach as part of duty to cooperate discussions literally a couple of months ago. So unless anybody has any other view, I think unfortunately we don't have a consistent approach.
Yes. Oops, beg your pardon again. Very helpful, I think, or not, if you know, the great scheme of things. It's helpful to know. I think one feels that might fit into what's been said about I don't know what the inspectors who've examined those plans have concluded, but presumably a case was made obviously a case was made that those approaches were sound, different approaches were sound, and inspectors have accepted that, which suggests that the point that maybe 4111 isn't, you're not obliged to use it, but if you do, it's acceptable in principle, is the way of thinking of it.
Yeah, I think it's quite noticeable that Wandsworth and Islington both admit that they're going to review their plan before 2029 actually starts to bite. So there seems to have been a bit that we know there's a problem, we know the London plan's going to be reviewed, but those plans, because they were working their way through before us, there were several more years before they hit the 29 year, whereas of course for us 29 is incredibly close and it's even in our 5-year land supply, so, or on the edge of it. So it's a far more important discussion. I'm aware it cropped up in Hounslow in the past, but the Hounslow plan was withdrawn. Right. That was another plan that was going into Greenbelt, and there was a lot of discussion about what the correct approach would be.
I'm aware that Waltham Forest's recently been adopted. Do you know what?
I think they've got a higher housing target. I haven't looked at that one today, but.
Okay, anyway, it was more just, to see if, I think the fact there's an inconsistent approach is the answer to the question. Okay, thank you. And I'll come on to the GLA advice that was discussed yesterday, and it's been the same common ground under there's questions on that. It was discussed yesterday. I don't want to necessarily raise that now. So that's obviously some matters of principle over whether to use that, and maybe people wish to comment on that. But I will move on to the components as well, just to cover all of those points off. So we'll use the phrasing in the paragraph as a guide, but I may take it slightly out of order, and answers might take me slightly out of order. We start with the paragraph talks about using the SHLA 2017. My understanding is that you've not relied on the SHLA 2017. Just again, if you might want to just highlight I've got your answer to that in the topic paper and statements, but if you perhaps just explain the justification to that or clarify it.
Yes, sir. The SHLA 2017 was considered to be simply out of date. And furthermore, there are some complexities around how that addressed actual capacity. It was quite an unusual approach that used probability to reduce capacities. And so particularly going into the later years of the plan period, I think it's fair to say that the London SHLA could not be relied upon to produce accurate estimates because of the way it phased sites.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. We'll come on to how you've identified capacity as in alternative to that later, I think. The paragraph states that you should take into account any additional capacity that could be delivered as a result of committed transport infrastructure improvements. And I think, again, we're right in correct in saying that the housing topic paper says, well, you've looked into that, and as far as you're concerned, there's no additionality over and above what's already in your supply, and so you've considered that as required, but there's nothing to add. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Thank you. Okay. And again, if anyone wishes to rebut that, they'll have the opportunity to. Okay, I'll move on then to the rolling over of housing capacity assumptions applied in the London Plan for small sites. Now, there was no preliminary questions relating to this, I don't think, but in the matters statement, it doesn't say anything particularly about it. But in other matter statements, and obviously in the housing topic paper, I think the conclusion is that the assumption, which I think is around 3,500, is overly optimistic. And so you've, based on your past take-up rates and your own assessment, you've come up with a figure of smaller than that, which I can't recall off the top of my head, but and that was your position. Again, reading the statements of common ground with GLA, the revised statement of common ground with GLA recently, I happened upon, and it was talked about yesterday, a statement which says, oh, well, we've changed our mind now, we're going to meet those requirements. So I think some explanation as to what the current situation is as you see it, and some, again, to preempt any further comments, is what's changed. And effectively, if I'm going to accept this, what is unsound then about what you submitted?
Yes, sir. It is a confusing position, and recognize there was also an error in one of the figures published. So the reason that we did not initially run with the GLA's suggested target for small sites, which is 353 dwellings per annum. I'll refer to these in annual figures just for simplicity, was simply based on our monitoring information that we didn't think that that was a realistic trend. And literally what has changed is just 2 additional years of monitoring information. We can now show that over the past 5 years, we actually have delivered that 353 dwellings per annum, very close to it. I believe it's almost exactly similar. So that is just provides evidence, and we're happy to submit that, of course, to you, to suggest that we now think it is a deliverable figure, you know. And this goes to the heart of, you know, there was obviously considerable debate about the small sites figures at the London Plan examination. And it's what we're really talking about here is the impact of London Plan Policy H2, particularly in Enfield, where we don't have an up-to-date local plan. So has that swayed decisions on small sites to increase the delivery of small sites, because it's a much more permissive approach than was previously in place prior to the adoption of the London Plan in 2021. So we've had a kind of a monitor and manage approach in this respect, and we've, you know, just based on the evidence, we now think that that actually is an achievable figure.
Okay, thank you. So how does this then alter the overall requirement or the components of the requirement? What effect does this have on the the overall situation?
It's not a great effect, sir, because in effect, we're simply saying that instead of 281 dwellings per annum, it's 353, which is, I think, 72 dwellings per annum difference. So multiplied over the number of years of the plan period, we think it's around an additional 1,200 homes. And not to kind of presage further debates about land supply, but of course, we've just demonstrated that a permission of almost 1,600 homes has already lapsed. So we don't think that this is expected to have a great impact on our overall figures.
This sounds like it'll be something we have to go through the line by line on, but just as a matter of principle, your lapsed permission that you talked about, the big one, you're still hoping though that that's going to form part of your overall supply and thus form part of your overall capacity moving forward, isn't it? So it's not necessarily a sort of give with one hand, take away with the other, because yes, it might be that the lapsed permission falls out of the 5-year supply or the 10-year supply, but it might still be part of the planned period supply. So if you've got an extra 1,200 dwellings, that you were not anticipating, would that? Well, I guess we'll come on to how it affects your justification for releasing Greenbelt, for example. But does it not have any effect? Bear in mind, you've got a capacity-based requirement. Does it not have any effect on the 30? Or 3,449 dwellings a year, or 30, whatever the figure will, 32,000, 33,000. How does it not affect that?
No, it certainly will impact it, sir. It certainly will impact the overall figure.
But are you saying the overall figure goes up because you've now got extra capacity, so your requirement goes up? Or are you saying you no longer need to release areas of Greenbelt and the capacity remains the same, and we've no longer got the exceptional circumstance to release Greenbelt because we've got an extra 1,200 units? You know, how does it play out in terms of the overall strategy? Is my question.
We don't think that 1,200 additional dwellings is going to change the overall spatial strategy or the case for exceptional circumstances whatsoever. But it may be that if we were to properly accord with the 4.111 and to re-go through the steps of calculating that, then yes, it would change the requirement. Although I would put to you that, you know, the requirement and the supply are not necessarily the same figures, and there could be space for an additional buffer there, as we have already calculated, and that could be an additional buffer. And just to can I make a small further point about the Coliseum Retail Park? The reason for the site's lapsing, according to the site promoter, is a question of viability. And the site promoter is seeking to deliver a purely employment-led scheme, as I understand it, on the site. Just going back to that wider point about the viability, it's often said that in Enfield, employment schemes have a greater viability, particularly in the eastern half of the borough, than residential. So the value of employment land is greater than residential land with consent. So I think it just goes to the point about whether the site will feature in the housing land supply in the future is to be determined, I believe.
I think that does need to be just a flag needs to be put against the Coliseum site in relation to the question of its deliverability or indeed developability, or whether it can be properly put into any part of the supply for the purposes of altering any part of the case for release of the greenbelt. So that will come up, no doubt, but it may be that that has to be part of the detailed consideration.
Yeah.
I think what I'm going to need from the council is if I ask how is it going to change the requirement, if you say it's almost definitely going to change the requirement, that's probably not that helpful today, because we can't discuss it. If the answer is it doesn't, because these figures are going to be subsumed within the overall assessment, fine, we'll discuss that when we get into the overall assessment. If it has no effect, then fine. But or if you were to conclude, well, the capacity's gone up, so the requirement goes up, it doesn't affect anything else in terms of strategy, that's okay, we can discuss that. But to say it almost definitely will affect something, but I don't know how, because you've not told me how, it doesn't really get me anywhere.
I think whether I can help on that. So that's why the relevance of the Coliseum site needs to be put in play again at some point when considering the degree to which it is capable of coming forward needs to be taken into account. Because if that is factored in, then it doesn't make any difference to the overall position. And I think the way that Mr. Anderson-Frank was dealing with it was to say, well, look, if you just ignore all of the issues around lapsing of that site, for example, then it will have an effect, because you are going to be increasing the level of the small site delivery. But that's why it is a little more nuanced and requires consideration of those issues in detail.
It does. Sorry, I'm going to be quite up. It requires me to consider that,
Yes.
but I need but I need an argument from you as to what. So if your argument is, well, the Coliseum Retail Park and other things are not part of, from this point on, we don't think they're going to be part of the capacity, and therefore it's a like-for-like swap. We've increased one, we've moved things around, but actually it doesn't make a difference. Fine, that's fine. So if it's going to have a change, I will obviously come to a view at some point. You will put those things to me, and I will, no doubt, there might be people say, well, that could come forward, and we'll be horse trading and whatever on figures, but. And then there'll be a number that comes out at the end of it. But I do need to know what the council's actual position is, and if at the moment I'm getting a slight, maybe I'm just being obtuse, but I'm getting a slight mismatch between, on one hand, it might not make any difference, and then on the other, I'm told, well, it's inevitably going to make a difference. So I just need to know what it means. And if as of we stand today, as far as you're concerned, it doesn't alter anything, because it's all got to come out, then fine. But if it's going to alter that final number, I need to know that.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I think, sir, yes. What I meant to say is that it could be capable of altering the figure, but no. At the present time, we see there to be a balance of different factors that could either increase or decrease the supply, and we consider those factors to be currently in balance.
Thank you. Well, that's cleared up, so at least I know where we're going from there, what your position is. Thank you. I'm going to move on then to the phrase in the paragraph is of local evidence of identified capacity, and we've talked a lot about this already, what that means and how it can be interpreted and so on. The London plan, as you've said a few times, doesn't actually define what it means by that. Is that your position? There's no definition of what it means.
Yes.
We talked about the phrase consultation with GLA yesterday and what that means in practice, and there's a difference of opinion seemingly between Enfield and GLA as to whether it should be interpreted as, in your view, and I'm summarising this so we don't have to, but in your view, it should be taken as the normal meaning of the language. We've consulted with you, you don't have to agree. GLA's view, as I took it, if anyone disagrees, was that no, they, as far as they're concerned, the interpretation is that it should means agree, and that's, I think, for me to consider. That's not. I'm not. We can have that debate again, but I heard all that yesterday. If anybody wants to raise that,
Yes.
There's a difference of view, which I will take away with me. I'm writing saying that the London Plan places no requirement on the council to, and I'm getting into Greenbelt release now, no requirement on the council to consider Greenbelt release in determining what other local capacity or additional local capacity exists. Is it? No.
That's right.
And in the normal course of events, if you were to say, if I would say, well, what is your deliverable and developable capacity at any time, would that include Greenbelt land? And I mean here, I think this is where the paragraph says identified capacity, so additional identified capacity. So again, we might be getting into the long grass of what that means, but if is Greenbelt part of the identified capacity of a borough, as in prior to a local plan review?
It was certainly not identified in the London Schla, but I suppose I could just refer to the wording in the Housing and Economic Land Availability Assessment where those sites were classed as potentially developable.
Right. Well, the Greenbelt sites were classed as, okay. It's an interesting conclusion.
Subject to further analysis.
Well, exactly, yeah, well, subject to very special circumstances if the planning application, or subject to exceptional circumstances. It seems a somewhat optimistic conclusion, given what hoops need to be jumped through. But okay. But you wouldn't be including Greenbelt sites in your developable or deliverable supply as part of your annual monitoring or anything like that, would you?
Oh, no, sir.
No. Conversely, I've asked whether the London Plan requires you to consider Greenbelt. Similarly, does the London Plan prohibit you from considering Greenbelt, in your view, as part of the equation?
No, it doesn't. No.
And does the London Plan say anything specific about if you are considering releasing Greenbelt, other than G2's fairly standard text about exceptional circumstances? Does it guide boroughs in where and how that should be considered? As in, Greenbelt release should, and then, if you like, criteria for how that would be considered?
No, it doesn't, sir. I mean, there are the provisions in G2, but they're very broad, of course, indicating exceptional circumstances. It is, I think, important to note that there are references within the plan, the London Plan, to release, to accommodate potentially the housing target, and one of them is that which Mr. Byrne referred to this morning, 648, which requires consideration of the use of brownfield sites and underutilised land when assessing whether or not it's necessary under G2 to release Greenbelt land for meeting the housing target. You know our position on that, that we have engaged with that and dealt with it accordingly. But it does at least show that it's not out of account, and that of course accords with the historical position with regard to the examination into the London Plan, which rejected the suggestion by the Mayor at the time that the Greenbelt should be sacrosanct and without any ability to have needs accommodated within it. So there is, to that extent, some indications that it's both permissible and a framework for the steps that need to be undertaken in order to justify that exceptional case.
In terms of identifying the capacity overall and additional local capacity, and again, I'm probably, you have answered this to an extent. The London plan, I'll rephrase it. The London plan doesn't suggest, the issues that have been highlighted to me about the contextual, if you like. You've used the phrase contextual issues, like what the standard methodology might say, various standard methodologies might say about underlying need. There are other factors that have been put forward about affordable housing, family housing, type and tenure, and so on. Other people have raised issues to be about provides an opportunity to narrow the London housing gap and such things. I'm right in saying, though, that in terms of paragraph 4111, there's nothing in that suggests that that is something you should be taking into account when calculating your capacity.
No, I'm sorry. No, I accept that.
Similarly, again, conversely, anything which would preclude you, in your view, from looking into those factors as part of coming up with a requirement figure?
No, nothing to preclude it. And as I indicated, it is actually drawn up in a way that is suggestive of other factors being capable of being taken into account. It just doesn't specify what those are.
If the council, and again, this is just trying for me to understand how 4111 works in practice, if the council had decided not to look into Greenbelt at all, it said actually our identified capacity is and I've got a figure that I've had because I asked for a non-Greenbelt figure, yes. That figure, and come to the examination on that basis, would it still be compliant with 4111?
Potentially, but it depends on actually the judgments that have been made around what amounts to local evidence of identified capacity and the judgments that have been reached as to whether or not there is capacity within the green belt. And I take your point, so that of course there's a preclusive approach or preclusive aspects to green belt release, but if it is identified as potentially capable of coming forward, then its absence may indicate that it wouldn't be appropriate just to rely upon the brownfield element.
But under the framework, there would have been no requirement to look into this, would there, if they had not wanted to, unlike the new framework, if you'd have, it's difficult for anyone to say under the previous framework, you should have looked into the green belt. If you haven't, you're under no obligation to.
No. Yeah. Quite, I accept that, but it does come down to then judgment as to whether, as I say, that there is capacity, bearing in mind what essentially is an iterative process of considering also the question of the degree to which any of those sites are capable of satisfying exceptional circumstances, which of itself will then require consideration of other factors, including the overarching levels of housing need in a particular borough's area.
Thank you. Bearing in mind that there's no, and again, this is a point that's sort of been made, I think, bearing in mind there's no, if there is no limitation on what you can look at in terms of capacity, and effectively you can make an argument for whatever you want should be in that. What actually stops this being a bit of a free-for-all then, and any kind of overarching constraint or limitation to delivery that again gives me or gives anybody actually, the context in which this is all set. Because it seems to me, well, if 4.11 is silent, or sorry, the plan is silent, and so on and so forth, and we can, and we don't have to get agreement from, we have to get agreement from GLA about what those sites are, and we can, identify what's deliverable, developable. We can just basically have as much as we want. Is that, and is that how it can work?
No, it couldn't work like that for obvious reasons. And the reason it doesn't work like that is because ultimately a conclusion has to be reached about capacity, taking into account, as I say, the sustainability of the various sites that are being considered, as it has been done in this case.
Okay.
And continually there's been an indication of the iterative nature of the assessments that have been undertaken, including that relating to the greenbelt sites that ultimately have been chosen.
So ultimately, if I were to come to the view, again, that if I come to the view that those sites, and if we get onto those through my logic gates, if we get onto those sites and I were to conclude they are sound, then they obviously part of the capacity. If I conclude because they're not sound and couldn't be made so, then they fall out of that capacity, and the requirement would be
exactly so
amended accordingly.
That's exactly the point, and that's why our case before you has very much focused upon whether, in fact, there are exceptional circumstances here for the release of those sites. It obviously would just be entirely impermissible to say, well, they should be released simply because the requirement is there, because then it would be entirely self-serving.
Well, that's what I was saying. I've got a note here about self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes the requirement is X. We've released, well, the requirement is only X because the green belt is being released, and therefore we must release the green belt to satisfy X. It becomes, and this is a point that the circular argument that people have been arguing. I think that's the point people are making about the circular argument.
Exactly so, and if that were the justification, then one could understand that sort of argument. But as you'll have seen, in terms of the various factors, those that go beyond the question of housing need. With regard to the housing need, it doesn't settle on what the requirement is. It takes into account the overarching levels of housing need that have been set out under the previous standard methodology and other factors, which one can see in the local housing need assessment, and now added to by virtue of the increases under the current MPPF.
But again, I'm sorry, labouring a point a little bit, but if in normal circumstances you identify your demographic need via standard methodology and or whatever, you then assess your capacity to meet that demographic need.
Yes.
If you've got an oversupply, then wonderful. You can decide to go above it or whatever. If you've got an undersupply, you've got choices to make. Ask your neighbours, go into the green belt or not.
Yes.
Argue you're not meeting. Obviously, in this case, we're not. I'm not in a situation where I'm. Although taking the point, this is what I'm, taking the point that there are these things that have been. I'm not pegging, or the council isn't pegging the requirement against a demographic need. So it is a variable depending on what is the outcome of.
Yes, and it is the result of the wording of 4111, which sets out how the mayor considered things should be done, or the way in which things should have been done, or should be done, and in respect of the post-2029 period.
I do apologise. I've been enjoying myself so much. I didn't realise it's 11:30. I really have been getting carried away there.
Well, I think it gets to the crux of the issues, and that's why I fully understand why you want to.
I'm having a whale of a time. I'm sure everyone else probably isn't, but I do apologise. Actually, then, bearing in mind this is 11:30, I think I've got a few more questions, but very few. Yeah. So before I do apologise. I've been getting carried away. It is now 25 to. We'll come back at 10 to 12. Beg your forgiveness.
Thank you, sir.
We'll resume when everyone's ready.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you. I do apologise for going on. It's the one time I don't mind being interrupted. If anybody does desperately want to have an adjournment, then please feel free to put your microphone on and tell me. And I'll endeavour to be more wary of the clock. I was going through my questions. I had a few more about this, but because I've been wittering on for a while, I'll probably give someone the opportunity to come in. What I'll say is they were generally about, and they may well come up, and I may well ask them, but at the moment they were in relation to, if you like, some of these contextual issues, or some of the other issues which have been put forward as to why the requirement is as it is, and justification for greenbelt release and so on, and things like, I did mention in passing the local housing need assessment and what that has to say. We've got a session next week on issue 2.2, I think it is, or 2.3, about meeting the needs of other groups. The local housing need assessment is obviously important to that. Issues have been raised, and I've raised issues about how up to date it is. Issues have been raised about how it's interpreted. Unless it comes up now, fine if it does, but I'm going to put a pin in my questions about that until next time. But obviously on the proviso that clearly any answers I receive on that will have a bearing on my conclusions today. So it's rather than basically have the debate twice. I'll if it comes up, it comes up, but otherwise I'm going to leave that for now. But obviously, as I say, it may well be that I ask questions, or some of my questions will relate back to this point. But bearing in mind, it's also going to relate to the Greenbelt exceptional circumstances as well. I'm just going to make that point now. So, so with that in mind, and I'm not going to say questions 2.2 to 2.4 of my questions were about the GLA advice, which I'll come on to as well. So does anybody have anything they wish to say about the post-2029 figure? I'll start. Everyone's going. I'm going to start with Barclay Homes. Isn't it? Barclay Homes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think, as you suggest, I'm going to talk about the post-2029 requirements. I think sort of go back to some principles and then how those relate to the council's approach. And I mean, the sort of starting premise of this, I've sort of, having looked at this, and I was at the Hounslow EIP where some of this sort of cropped up as well, and I think setting the targets post-2029 in London is like being in the sort of twilight zone of planning, because in a sense it's just that it isn't as clear as we would all want it to be, quite frankly, and we're just sort of trying to navigate through and reconcile it. So what I wanted, we've expressed our sort of view and approach in our hearing statements, which is consistent with what we said to the Hounslow EIP as well, which unfortunately the plan collapsed before a sort of helpful conclusion could be reached by one of your colleagues as to who was actually right. But anyway, I'll run through that. I mean, at one level, it sort of essentially reaches the same conclusion, which is that the council's sort of capacity-based approach with Greenbelt release is correct, but sets it within a slightly wider context than just 4.111. So, if you kind of bear with me and interrupt me if I'm not being clear, please do. So I think to start with, in terms of the soundness of the plan, it obviously has to be consistent with national policy. And what does national policy say? So Para 11, plans must meet the development needs of their area, and strategic, that's A, 11A. Then B, strategic policies should as a minimum provide for objectively assessed needs for housing and other uses. And it's then open for a plan not to meet those needs, but obviously they've got to be justified against Para 11B 1, Roman numerals 1 and 2. Para 17 says that strategic policies, i.e. a policy that sets, in this case, sets a requirement, can be in local plans and or a spatial development strategy. Para 61 says that strategic policies should be informed by local housing need assessment conducted using the standard method. There's obviously the exceptional circumstances as an alternative. And then Para 67, and this is quite an important one, is that strategic policymaking authorities should establish housing requirement figure for the whole area to show the extent to which identified housing need and unmet need can be met over the plan period. And we then know from Paras 22 and then sort of implied by Para 75 that that plan period has as a minimum to be 15 years. from adoption. So taken together, there's a policy requirement that means each London borough has to have a housing requirement which shows the extent to which their identified housing need can be met over the planned period. So there's two parts to that. The requirement obviously isn't the same as the housing need, but you have to know the housing need and show how those things compare. And you can do that.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's sort of the point I was getting at
Yeah.
with my question about how it relates to a demographic need. It's not related to a demographic need, and that's the point I was making. That the norm is what you're describing. The norm, you identify the demographic need, and then you assess your capacity, and their requirement target might be different to your need. I understand that.
Yeah, and what I think I'm trying to get to is that the norm applies here as well as it does as if the London plan doesn't exist. Only that the London plan does that exercise up to 2029, and after that period, the norm applies, albeit with the addition of whatever the London plan says about what you do beyond 2029. Apologies if I've laboured that point unnecessarily. And para 17 says that you can do that exercise through the local plan or the London plan. So you can have essentially a hybrid approach, and we know, what the London plan does, and it's very specific in terms of H1 that it sets those targets for that 10-year period, but it doesn't actually do anything beyond that. And the only thing that deals with beyond that is essentially the 4.1.11 point. And as the council have explained, that's not a closed sort of requirement for how that's done. So what does one draw from that? Well, one concludes that it does fall the borough to fulfil the MPPF obligations beyond 2029, which means it has to meet the full OAN for that period as a minimum, unless the provisions of the other parts of Para 11 apply. In order to determine the extent to which the full OAN is being met by the policies, you have to identify the full OAN for the period beyond it, and then you do that through the standard method. And I'll come on to how Enfield, we say, have fulfilled that. But once the OAN position has been identified, consideration then turns to the capacity issues which may exist within Enfield and the judgments that you make as to the extent or not of Greenbelt release and whether that's justified. And then once you've done that, you have fulfilled the requirements of Para 67. So then comes we're saying at that point about what Para 146 says in terms of Greenbelt release, because what that requires as part of exceptional circumstances is one has to take account of the identified need for development in the area, and then essentially the conclusions about how much of that is being met through the other steps that are identified in 146. So in terms of the strategy as a whole for Greenbelt land release being justified, the extent to which the plan does or does not meet the needs of the area and the extent of those needs is a consideration in relation to the soundness of the plan, and then ultimately settling on what the requirement figure is. So if the requirement is inevitably capacity constrained because there's a finite amount of land, developable land that's identified, then the requirement ends up being that constrained figure plus whatever Greenbelt release the council has justified against Para 146. And the reason this is consistent with the London plan and 4.1.11 is that if the London plan allows for Greenbelt release with exceptional circumstances, to do that in line with MPPF 146, one has to look at the need figure and how much of that need you can meet. And then whatever you provide on top of that is inevitably additional supply, which then informs a higher requirement than the capacity-based figure that you would otherwise have arrived at without Greenbelt release. I don't care to trust, I wasn't losing.
I understand it's fairly standard stuff. I'm aware.
It is, but the point I suppose that's being made is that it's literally the only exercise is a 1.4.11 point without the application of the tilted balance in terms of the framework, and that the justification for Greenbelt release and the taking into account of the OAN, or the local housing need figure, has been considered as part of the exercise the council have arrived at in setting their requirement, because they've done that within the exceptional circumstances paper as well as within the housing topic paper. So one shouldn't therefore look at 4111 in a narrow sense and say, well, you only look at those steps and then the number is almost the sort of a kind of reductively arrived number following those steps. You have to apply 1411 in the context of the requirements of the framework as a whole, you know, looking at need over the plan period and then whether exceptional circumstances are justified, taking into account the level of unmet need that arrives from that. So I suppose it might sound like it's sort of dancing on the head of a pin, but it's a sort of, because in a sense the ultimate answer is the same. But I think it's important to set into context that the need figure beyond 2029 isn't constrained to a judgment about whether one has followed precisely the steps set out in 4111.
Thank you. Understood. Mrs. Stevens, you've put your sign down, I see. Before I move on, just for completeness on your point, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm aware of the council referred to its context, and it's very much in the exceptional circumstances argument they've made. They've referred to this context of underlying need and other things which factor into that, into what I've just talked about, affordable housing, the family homes, etc. There are other contextual things which justify that. But obviously, the requirement, there is no, in terms of the evidence base, if you like, what's been put to me and what's been sort of argued to me, and I was specifically asked about the relationship of the standard methodology to 4.111, knowing full well what you're talking about. There is no expression really in the process that's gone through, which is to say there's no expression to do it how you've suggested it should be done. You know, there's no sort of our standard methodology requirement is whatever this number is. We've assessed the capacity against that figure. We can't meet that in its entirety, and therefore we're doing the very best we can to reach that number before. Because if you go beyond the number, then you get into 11D, 11B territory, and but that's not the argument. It is. I mean, as you say, it might end up at the same position, but it's not the argument that's being made to me. I mean, technically from the council, that's not quite what's being done. It's sort of it's a slightly different approach. So are you saying really what the council should do is sort of set it out in that way, or are you saying, well, as it amounts to the same thing, it doesn't really matter? I'm trying to understand, is there any change?
I think my Twilight Zone point was that, in a sense, it's not 100% sort of precisely clear what the correct approach is, and the point that was correctly made earlier on about the various approaches in the other London Borough plans is, I think, quite an instructive one. I think what I'm saying is, when we've set out our matter statement, is that is what I've described is what we would describe as the appropriate approach. And I think when you fairly read the exceptional circumstances paper and the housing topic paper in combination, that is actually what the council have done. Because the housing topic paper, in a sense, describes how 4111 has been applied to arrive at a realistic capacity before Greenbelt release is concluded upon. And then the exceptional circumstances topic paper then says, well, here is the level of need that we have, and then this is the justification through exceptional circumstances in Para 146 for those additional releases. And then inevitably, the residual for the 4111 capacity plus those Greenbelt releases naturally form the housing requirement. So in a sense, what was I think was described, I don't know about who, but as a sort of circular argument, I suppose I'm trying to explain why it's not circular, if you see what I mean, because the requirement in a capacity constrained situation in the context of Para 146 of the NPPF is inevitably would inevitably reach the conclusion that
I think the well, first things first. I get after all, I get the impression that you're not saying anything's unsound and you're looking for a change. That's fundamentally you're supporting the council position. You just think that there's probably a different way of laying it out, but you get to the same result. I think the circular argument thing is if we get, as you say, get to the end of this debate and we say, right, the requirement is, I'm just going to use round figures because it's 35,000, and therefore we must release the greenbelt to satisfy a requirement of 35,000, that is the circular argument because it's justifying itself. If you're saying we need, the requirement is 35,000, sorry, the capacity, the requirement is 35,000 because that is the capacity, and if the capacity were to, you know, we're not beholden to that number to justify greenbelt release, it's just the result of the greenbelt release. I think that's the subtly different arguments.
And the subtly different point is it's in the context of housing need being up.
Yeah, no, but that will come into the exception.
Yeah,
it's going to be picked up in exceptional circumstances.
So, but I suppose it's not sort of being circular isn't. It's not a criticism, and I'm not actually sure it is circular because in the sense that the housing requirement is a figure. They haven't set a housing requirement, as I understand it, and then gone, here are the greenbelt releases to.
No, I think it's my point.
Yes.
I think the phrase has been used. Trying to understand where it comes from and what people mean by it. I've not come to any view at all as to whether it's right or not. But I think I understand the difference between what the council say, what is meant and what others. I understand those points, and I can obviously come to a view myself on that. But it's useful. I mean, the main thing is, I think, that in broad terms, you're supportive of the approach. Yeah, okay. Mr. Stevens, your board's gone up and down many times. Speak now or forever hold your peace, I suspect. Yeah. And I apologise to those who had your board, but I suspect the arguments from that side so might be different to this side, so I may as well hear them all in one go.
Yeah, I will say something. I was hesitating. I think the council is in an invidious position because of the lack of clarity within the London plan, and having been involved in that London plan, with hindsight, we probably would have pushed for something to make it much clearer about what local authorities should be doing when they've got to set 15-year plan periods. Enfield is in a very, very difficult position here. My approach at other London Borough examinations is that I've tended to support rolling on in the absence of any other constructive way to go about assessing need, taking as read the assumption in the London plan and the view of the GLA that boroughs don't need to undertake their own assessments of need. Sometimes boroughs strictly apply 4111 and just look at the capacity in the GLA SHLAR 2017. But if that comes out with a figure which is considerably lower than the 10-year target, then, you know, I will tend to argue that perhaps rolling on is better, and I think that was the case in the Richmond upon Thames local plan, which is still yet to be determined. So, in honesty, we have muddled through this process, and it's only reached heightened attention here with Enfield, of course, because of the implications for greenbelt release. But just refer you to the panel report of the London plan. If I could just pull that up, where, sorry, here it is, yeah, paragraph 151, the panel does say that simply rolling forward the existing targets beyond 2029 would not be effective. Paragraph 418D at the time, that was the draft plan, gives guidance to the boroughs about how to calculate targets after that date. And they say, whilst this does not provide absolute certainty, it nonetheless provides a framework for future plan making at a borough level, although it should be adjusted to refer to evidence of any identified local housing capacity. And I think that's what Enfield Council has done, while also taking into account other contingent factors, which I've emphasised in my representations and statement, which is London's strategic undersupply, which is already baked into the existing plan that Mr. Spry referred to yesterday. That's the difference between the 52,000 target and the 66,000 GLA objective assessment of need, plus the evidence that's come to pass since the adopted plan of London's inability to meet its own London plan target. And Mr. Spry helped write a paper for the government, its expert review of the effectiveness of the GLA in meeting its targets. So those are contingent factors where I think, and then taking into account the direction of national policy and the new NPPF, and the future housing targets for London, and the GLA's confirmed that that's going to be 88,000 and will involve Greenbelt review, I think the council has taken the right approach by triangulating those factors. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. A question for you, just on your view on this. Particularly, you're obviously involved in a lot of these examinations and so on. GLA, you were here yesterday. GLA said that, as far as they were concerned, my understanding of their point was they feel that this, the effect of the increased figures and the change in standard methodology and what that means for the distribution of growth across London and release of Greenbelt, I mean, it should be dealt with through the London plan review at strategic level. What's your, I mean, and thus, if you like, this plan should not jump ahead of that by going beyond what the GLA considered to be the constraints of 4111.
It's like a prematurity argument, though, isn't it? It's saying that, well, we must hold off doing anything when we have a severe housing crisis and a severe under-delivery in London. I don't think that's acceptable. These are suitable, deliverable and developable sites, and I think it's entirely legitimate and in the public interest for Enfield to allocate them.
Thank you. So obviously in that context as well, is where you've been in other examinations suggesting rolling forward is the correct approach. So again, it's I'm not saying you're not beholden to anybody, and that you can change your mind, but
it's become the common approach, acceptable approach. Yeah. Okay. But by no means is it the only acceptable approach, as Mr. Spry and the council have accepted, and they have based what they've done on paragraph 4111.
Okay. Understood. Thank you very much. Before I move on to the other views, is there anything just so to keep these things so you don't get too many, is there anything you want to come back on, anything that's been raised on this side of the table?
No, so obviously we're happy to hear what is said by Berkeley. And just one point, I think, that arises from what Mr. Stevens said with regard to prematurity. Of course, prematurity is dealt with in part in the NPPF, but not in the context of plan making, which is important, actually, because it shows that the government doesn't think that it's right to have those sorts of grounds available in the delivery or in the production of a plan as an objection by the strategic authority. So quite rightly, there's an imperative to make the plan, and an imperative to make the plan against the requirements in relation to housing need that are or that exist under the standard method or otherwise.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Thanks. I will move on then to this side, and we'll start. I'll just take it in anti-clockwise order. So if we start with Hadley Wood, thank you.
Yes. Sorry. Just coming back to the windfall sites, where the figures increased by 1,200, but the 33,280 overall figure, we're being told, is not increasing. So does that then mean, I assume that means that not all the sites that are allocated are actually needed in order to meet the 33,280 if they found an extra 1,200 homes?
Again, that's a question rather than a statement, but so I'm not answering that question. I'm not my role to answer that. I think the point that was made, I'm just going to say, as I understand the point that was made, is that there are sites that are allocated or have been, or whether allocated or at least included in the capacity assessment, which the Coliseum Retail Park was the one that was given the example, may no longer be deliverable. Or developable or part of the capacity. So, yeah, I mean, I think the conclusion was that there'd be the number doesn't go up. I mean, this has got to be a set. I mean, this is a thing we've got to go through in a subsequent session, but the number won't, the overall requirement won't go up. How you get to that number will change. And whether that's legitimate or not, I guess, is the next question for another day.
But I presume then, like the Coliseum Retail Park, if you don't take account of it, and then it does come forward,
Well, that's probably where the phrase minimum of comes in. I mean, obviously the plan allows for, there is an element of windfall. The small sites allowance and windfall might be slightly different things because obviously that would be a large site windfall.
Yeah.
It's different to the small sites requirement. Windfalls happen. There's an accountancy for that. The requirement is always a minimum anyway, and there's a lapse rate and there's a headroom for flexibility. So
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other point? No, thank you. I can't see anything other than Enfield Society. Welcome. You weren't here yesterday, so welcome.
Sorry, it's John West from the Enfield Society. Can I just go back to your question of principle about whether the overall housing requirement has been prepared in general conformity with the London plan? The draft plan and everything I've heard sort of suggests that the council are trying to justify its deviation from the London plan by the housing figures. But none of the points that have been made, as I see it, are actually unique to Enfield. One of the reasons why we've got the GLA and we've got a London plan is to have a strategic look. Before the GLA was formed, there was difficulty that transport, industry, housing obviously, and strategic planning was all dealt with in a piecemeal way. And the purpose of the London plan is basically to ensure that there is an overall view. If each borough goes off and the 32 boroughs and does its own thing, I think the whole thing falls apart. And I'm just finding it difficult to understand why the council has adopted the view it has when it was clear from the presentation yesterday that the GLA are in the process of looking at a major review of the London plan, and that should be with us by early in 2026. That was just my point, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's a similar point to, I guess, the point I just made to Ms Stevens, and the point was, and the council, well, and also Mr Rees just answered that about the prematurity as a planning phrase. It's, if you've got a capital P prematurity, which is what the framework talks about, there might be a small p prematurity about other things, but so that's all within this, so that point is taken. Thank you. Yes, thank you. You've prompted a question for me, but I'll wait to ask it. Thank you very much. The O50s Forum, so thank you.
Thank you. I think I understand the argument about balancing, say, Colosseum with small sites. One of the things I think I recall accurately in a submission at some point was that one of the very, very positive sides of Enfield Council's housing development and bringing forward homes is that small sites get developed very, very quickly, and our record on that is particularly good. And so, in a sense, I'm thinking this is kind of comparing apples and pears. And from an older 50s perspective, those small sites, the windfall sites, are much more likely, I think, to be in areas of high sustainability with, transport and all the things that we know from the London Plan and other sources are crucial to older people. So I think I'd like to understand a bit better about the quality of those sites match and where they don't, and because I know there's a difference between supply and requirements and all that stuff, but I just wanted also to put a little plug in about under occupancy, simply because I don't quite know where that fits in. But I do think the small sites offers a very positive opportunity for older people, which I'd like to see pursued. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We can probably pick up on that next week when we talk about the how the plan addresses old people's, well, not just older people's housing, but it falls into that category. And again, probably again when we come to the actual, next week's probably going to be more of a matter of principle. Then we might get into the nitty-gritty of the wording at some point, and we can. It's a fair point, and I think the council, I think, could help us by explaining how under occupancy, if under occupancy has been taken into account in the capacity assessment, they can answer that question. Thank you, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, sir. Just building on that point, if I can just mention the NCAF Matter 4 statement looks at small sites in some detail in points 16 to 19 and identified the discrepancy to be around 2,000 to 3,800 homes, so much higher than the council's 1,200 figure. In terms of Coliseum Park, would be trouble understanding where we talk about this, but assuming if it's still going to be allocated as some form of housing, so it doesn't take away the 1,200 small sites, if you like, it doesn't balance it, it's still going to be, we presume, allocated for housing. If it's not allocated for housing and it's allocated for employment land, then that frees up employment land elsewhere to allocate for housing. Also making the point that if we're going to start removing sites, is there potential to resubmit sites to have balance in the process? I just want to draw attention to, on a slightly different point now, to what we're in London, and so it's important to understand what the London plan says in terms of some of this. And I just wanted to refer to 0.022. Where the London plan accepts.
Just bear with me while I open it.
Okay.
.022.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So there it says, the plan does not meet all of London's identified development needs. Work will need to be undertaken to explore the potential options for meeting this need sustainably in London and beyond. This is a matter for a future plan and requires close collaboration with local strategic authorities and partners. So we think there's a clear sort of statement of intent there about how the GLA wants to go about this. And the Mayor wants to go about this. They recognise the need isn't being fulfilled, but they are going to address it through a future London plan. And they come around quite quickly. We should recognise that. It's about sort of every 5 years London plans come around. So they are updated pretty quickly. And the update here, as we know, has already started on this London plan. So that turns us then, within that context, thinking about 4.1.11. And before you look away from your screen, sir, I just want to draw your attention to the point above 0.022, 0.021, which it says the plan provides an appropriate spatial strategy that plans for London's growth in a sustainable way. The housing targets set out for each London borough are the basis for the planning for housing for London. Therefore, boroughs do not need to revisit these figures as part of their local plan development unless they have additional evidence that suggests they can achieve delivery of housing above these figures whilst remaining in line with the strategic policies established in this plan. So that's the context, and then we go on to 4.1.11. And I have to say that, unlike I know a lot of people, people would definitely disagree with this, I think and we think that 4.11 is actually quite an elegant solution to a difficult problem. So what 4.1.11 attempts to do, and we think does it actually quite well and actually very clearly in our opinion, is balance the strategic objectives and the strategic vision for London and giving an element of control over that for the Mayor, whilst balancing and giving flexibility to the boroughs to increase their housing targets above the kind of minimums that would naturally fall out of 4.1.11. So you can identify a minimum figure within 4.11, and then you can say, well, look, you can do better than that, and you're allowed to, but it has to be in consultation with the GLA. Now, that consultation bit, of course, as we've spoken about already, I don't want to kind of go over it, is absolutely essential to this, because without it, you do get into this kind of land of the free-for-all. the potential sort of for a free-for-all. So that consultation element is absolutely crucial to this balance of flexibility for the boroughs on the one hand, but the control for the GLA in the other. And the GLA has shown flexibility. It's not, as far as I know, it's not objected to every single Greenbelt site. It has a particular problem about 2 of them. And it's set out its stall on those consistently. And its problems extend far beyond it just being Greenbelt land and make sense. So coming back very briefly, because I know we've discussed this, we've got these sort of arguments about the consultation, and there's the GLA's position that they sort of more or less have a veto, I suppose. They have to agree with sites, and we can see a sense in that in terms of not allowing the free-for-all that might otherwise happen. And then the council's approach, which says, well, no, it's more consultative, and we don't have to agree. We would say that if it is the latter, that actually we don't really think there was the consultation in the sense of the council coming to the table with an open mind and being prepared to change course. So we think that in that sense, the council has not met the consultation argument either way you look at it, in terms of 4.1.11. So that's where we find ourselves. And then, yeah, I think that's it really. I just want to be clear that we do think there is a real danger that if we just ignore that, don't give that the priority or the importance it deserves, it leads to some, not just circular arguments, it leads to some very kind of unappealing scenarios going forward for examinations, for basically arguing out, I mean, it happens a bit anyway, but arguing out every single site and how it relates to the housing requirement, rather than, as we've seen in our review of London local plans coming to examination, there seems to be a pretty good idea about what 4.1.11 means, and people accept it. There is this thing about rolling over that comes up, but in our view, that is a sort of is a slightly different nuance to that, I think, that may need to be understood, and that is that the rollover is not kind of disconnected from the capacity estimates, from the identifying capacity. It's saying, we can get there, therefore we can roll forward a target. So it's not kind of ignoring 4.1. It's not this totally different approach. It's saying, yeah, look, we can, and I think that's pretty much what the council did when it rolled over in 2018. It had identified the capacity following 4.1.11 and then said, okay, so we're going to roll forward. We can get to that 1,246 figure rolled forward, so we're going to roll it forward. But it became unstuck because rather than sort of positioning it as a capacity base, they just positioned it as a roll forward target. In terms of the GLA's current position, as I understand it, it's kind of come out of, I think it was Tower Hamlets maybe, who came forward with their minimum target. One of the London boroughs did. They came forward and the figure that can be identified from 4.1.11 as a minimum, that was more or less the figure they put in there. And the response from the GLA was, well, look, you should be looking at things have changed, obviously. You should be looking at least as rolling forward for the interim. And I don't think they were, and I could have got this wrong because I haven't seen the confidential letter, of course, but I don't think they were stipulating that that's what you have to do. I think they were saying, look, you can't, don't take the lower figure. Be reasonable. You can see what's happening. You've got to make an attempt at hitting a roll forward target. I hope that's useful. Thank you, sir.
No, very useful. Thank you. A couple of things. The whole in consultation thing is sort of percolating in my mind, and I suppose the one thing is interesting point you just made there is. If I were to, I mean, obviously the GLA and others' view for those sites, there's a view on those sites, in particular the two PL10, PL11. I know that. I'm not going to rehearse that. We know what the issues are. We're going to come on to that many, many times. I suppose, arguably, if I were to prefer their argument or your argument to the council's argument, then in effect, whether it was agreed with GLA's moot, because the outcome's the same, isn't it? I think it's the question of whether, if you like, the very fact that as of now, GLA are not in agreement means that, Drawbridge comes down, we don't look any further, or whether we say, well, okay, that's not, I still really need to look at the arguments behind that before I move forward. So I suppose I've got to decide, and I suspect I'll be deciding, well, assuming there are reasons to look at the sites, then I'll probably be doing that anyway, because it would be perhaps remiss of me not to at least examine the arguments that have been made about that. But take on board there is still a tension between what people's interpretation of that phrasing is. But ultimately, I still probably need to assess whether or not the sites are sustainable and the arguments that are being made. But I think yesterday, just in terms of the principle, I asked the council, and obviously you've made quite a lot of representation, this is very useful. I asked the council whether or not there was any indication in paragraph 4.11 that, or the London plan at all, that as part of your assessment of 4.11, the green belt was out of bounds, as it were. I think yesterday you were of the mind that actually, no, as far as you're concerned, I'm not saying you're speaking for everybody on that side of the table, but as far as you're concerned, it's legitimate to assess greenbelt as part of that assessment. You're just not happy about the outcome of that assessment. I know it's probably minimising. I know it's probably more than that, but that's the point. It's not necessarily opposed to them looking at greenbelt in principle. Just the results.
No, thank you. Certainly Better Homes Enfield position is that it was the council. It was within their ability to consider greenbelt sites as long as they're in conformity with the London plan, as long as they consult the GLA and everything that goes with it. And therein lies the problem. But no, you're correct, sir. Is the short answer.
So it comes back to, again, it all flows back potentially. And there's another it's a stage about exceptional circumstances principle. But if that stage was whether or not the capacity figure is correct, will flow back to whether those sites are suitable. And when the test of those sites suitable is whether they're in line with the London plan strategy and so on and so forth. That's all logical, I think. Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you. Yes. This is a very complicated situation. Get carried away. Sorry, can people hear me now? I apologise for that. Yes, London Plan is a strategic document. It covers the whole of London. That's a statement of the obvious, but it needs to be made. It's not just an Enfield issue. It's not just about housing need in Enfield as driving this whole process. That is not a correct understanding of the processes within the London Plan. Now, in terms of the post-29 roll forward situation, the London Plan sets out various factors that councils are supposed to address. One thing it says is that local councils are not supposed to carry out their own housing assessments. Enfield, of course, has done precisely that. And it's obvious why councils aren't supposed to carry out their own housing assessments because of the strategic nature of the London Plan. Now, however, it has been sort of inferred, I suppose, that this process in the London Plan is very restrictive. It's restrictive in one sense that it comes out, if you do the calculations, as some people have, that the actual figures at the end of it are far lower than the council would like in terms of targets. However, there is another aspect to this, because there is flexibility, I would say, within the London Plan procedure, and that is council, if they consider that not enough sufficient sites have been found in the SLAR, and other sites have become available, then they can add those in, provided that they meet the necessary infrastructure commitments. And the other, one of the main features of the London Plan, of course, is that new development should be development that meets all sort of environmental requirements in terms of reducing car usage and so on and so forth. Now, the council could have done that it could have looked at sites and added them legitimately if they fulfilled that criteria. But of course, there aren't any. And they say they couldn't come up with any sites that fulfil those criteria, which is why they've moved over to the Greenbelt, even though the sites they have actually identified in Greenbelt also aren't sites that fulfil environmental criteria. Because they're too far away from public transport and so on and so forth. So there we are. So the council is desperate to achieve much higher targets, but the way forward, from our point of view, is, as people have said, that the whole London planning process is a judicial process, very important, because it involves lots of consultation and being signed off by different parties and so on and so forth. And if you want to make changes to the London plan, which you could do, and there's a lot of a desire on the part of the government, no doubt, and the GLA to do precisely that, you can't just make ad hoc changes to it because you feel like it. You have to actually go through another process which requires a revision of the London plan, and that is the correct way forward. Essentially, this whole process that we're talking about this morning and in these hearings is jumping the gun. That is what this is all about. The appropriate response, in our view, is that all these issues are reconsidered and the whole a revised London plan then goes through that process. It may take a little time, usually does, but that is too bad. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, and back goes to Councillor. I got some points from that, but you may well pick them up. So I'll hand over to you to see if you want to respond to any of that.
Thank you very much. So yes, I think the first point arises from Mr. West's observations, and his essential point, at least at the end of his statement, was that a major review of the plan is going to happen. That's say the London plan is going to happen. So one can wait for that. And I think this also deals with councillors. Forgive me, I haven't got the nameplate. Can't see it. Councillor Smith. Sorry. Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Smith's point as well. And he says, well, look, it's jumping the gun. Well, the first point is that, of course, there's no policy that prevents the production of a local plan in advance of the next London plan. There's simply nothing in any part of the London plan that says that that is what should happen, particularly with regard to the delivery of housing. In fact, if you look at 4111, the aim of it, or at least it's within its purview, to require authorities to look beyond that position. It would have been very easy to say you should not do anything in advance of the next review of the plan, but it doesn't do that. Then Mr. Burns' points, if I can deal with those. He referred to two aspects of the plan, 0.021 and 0.022. He dealt with 0.022 firstly, of indicating that there's a recognition that the plan doesn't meet identified development needs, and it says work will need to be done to explore the potential options of meeting this need sustainably in London and beyond. This is a matter for a future plan. Well, yes, it's simply stating the obvious, but what it isn't doing is setting out, firstly, a policy. It's in the written statement. And secondly, it doesn't undermine and cannot undermine what is set out in H1 as added to by 4111. And in fact, what it is just a statement of the obvious and a recognition of the fact that the examination into the London plan found very clearly that this was a plan that wasn't doing what it should have done with regard to the meeting of objectively assessed needs. It's really a nod to that situation, rather than it being a prescribed approach for the future, which is how Mr. Byrne would have it. I say with respect. as to his other point, which is reliance on 0.021, namely that it deals with the strategy that is adopted within the plan, and then goes on, its latter part, boroughs do not need to revisit these figures as part of their local plan development unless they have additional evidence suggests they can achieve delivery of housing above these figures, whilst remaining in line with the strategic policies established in this plan. Where he says, well, that phraseology, that in line with the strategic policy of the plan, and I take into account his comments in writing as well when I make this point, he is essentially saying that there is a greenbelt restriction, and one cannot and should not be going into the greenbelt. But of course, that's no part of any particular policy within the London plan, as you know.
Sorry, I don't think Mr. Could I clarify that with Mr. Bain? He suggested that that's not his argument. He content. Don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Bain. That in principle, as part of 4111, the green belt is not out of bounds, so I call it. But it's the whether or not the sites themselves are in line with the strategic vision of.
So I was going to come on to that. I was going to say that there's inconsistency between that position being taken, and as I say, I referred to the fact that that's how it was also put in writing, and the approach that is adopted under 4111, namely that if you're undertaking a capacity assessment, and quite fairly, Mr. Byrne recognises it has the ability to take into account greenbelt sites. And I can deal with that point next, actually, the application of 4111. And, of course, that acknowledgement is a fair one because it reflects what we've said already. His point is that when one looks at the in consultation with, that is a break on what can be done by a local authority, a non-strategic authority. In effect, he's saying that means there is a requirement to agree. He's, as you put it, it's like a drawbridge. It's a gateway to allowing reliance on 4111. And if that were right, I mean, I've already set out yesterday my position on that because it just doesn't fit with the rest of the text in the London plan when you see in consultation with being used in its normal and natural way. But if it's right, it means that there's a very significant restriction on what can be done under 4111. And one would have expected to see that in clear terms, because all it needed to say was, shall be agreed by, as you see sometimes in local plans. And obviously wasn't used, and wasn't used for obvious reasons, which is that, of course, one must consult, but ultimately it's a matter of judgment for the authority. And the second point that he makes about that consultation is that, well, it wasn't openly done on the part of this council. That it's only if there is receptivity to the requirements of the authority, then that one can pass through that restriction, and it didn't happen here. Well, there was obviously consultation. We're content that it was a satisfactory level of consultation, but it becomes very complicated if one is supposed to then scrutinise carefully as to whether or not there had been openness in any particular case. I don't need to trouble you with having to determine that because we say that it is already satisfied. There was, I think, though, whilst the position is taken with regard to the application of 4111, I think there was also a suggestion by Mr. Byrne, and it may be that I've misunderstood it, and for that I apologise if it's right, that in some way it is right to consider a rollover situation rather than the use of 4111. Now, if that's right, there is simply no basis for that approach. the GLA had no basis for it. There's nothing within the plan that allows that sort of approach, at least specifically. Now, of course, I've said that one can take into account a standard method that can put one over the levels that a simple application of 4.11 would provide for. And by the same token, it must mean that one can look at it in a different way and have that more restricted approach. But there needs to be a proper justification for doing so. And there's none when one looks at it, at least in the light of, as Mr. Stevens has said, the very clear levels of need that are now in place, and Mr. Rowley, actually. So that's all I think I need to say about Mr. Burns' points. Councillor Smith suggested that local authorities are not allowed to revisit the levels or the housing targets, or rather the levels of housing need in their area. And I think he's drawn, he didn't say how the London plan said that that was the situation, but I think he's drawn that from 0021, the part of the written statement that we just looked at. That's not actually what it says. What it says is that boroughs do not need to revisit these figures, do not need to. It is not preclusive or precluding. So he's wrong about that. Then the other point he makes was that, well, 4.11 does allow for the scenario of identifying sites if there's sufficient infrastructure requirements. But again, that's not a correct reading of 4.11 because it's broader, as Mr. Byrne quite fairly acknowledged, it's broader than simply the reliance on a scenario where there are infrastructure requirements in place. The last point Councillor Smith makes is that, I think I noted him correctly when he said it, that the authority is desperate to achieve much higher figures. And I don't know whether or not that's a suggestion that in some way they are acting for a purpose outside of 4.111. If that is the suggestion, well, you have the evidence. I won't need to engage with it, but it's obviously rejected. So those are the points that I've made.
Thank you. There was the point that the over 50s forum made about under occupancy. I mean, we'll get into that in detail at some point, but just if there's any answer to how that has been, to give comfort that has been taken into account in the overall assessment at all?
Yes, so can I postpone that? We will provide an answer, but I want to be absolutely clear and comprehensive in it. And I fear that if I try to do it now, I won't be. And but we did note the point, and we will be returning to that issue.
Thank you. And the other point I wanted to just pick up on is a point Mr. West made about, and this also goes back, I suppose, to the discussion about what's happened elsewhere. And while I'm not necessarily tied to what's happened elsewhere or anything like that, it's useful context, is that the issues in Enfield with regard to increased housing needs, albeit some of the plans that have been discussed were pre-December 2024, but may well be standard methodology figures that are higher than their capacity and so on, or higher than the rollover, or higher than anything else, and so on and so forth. Affordability, family housing, etc., are actually common to many boroughs, none of whom have, as I understand it, sought to go into the green belt. Whether they've been precluded from going to the green belt, I don't know, because I'm not aware of every examination that's ever taken place. But
no, sir. I think it's very important to understand the context of each one of those plans in detail, rather than to rely on a point in the abstract, for obvious reasons. But what one can note is that it's absolutely clear that the strategy of the plan, the London plan, is not to preclude releases of the Greenbelt. And so when one is looking at any particular decision that might have been made in any particular authority, there's a requirement to review the multifaceted approaches that have been adopted in any particular case. And so to the extent that I do need to deal with Mr. West's point, I just say that whilst I note it, with respect, it's not helpful to the conclusion that needs to be reached, which is how do you interpret 4111, and ultimately what decision do you have to reach? And for fear of repeating myself, ultimately, 4111, quite compatibly with the plan, requires an assessment as to whether or not there are exceptional circumstances for the greenbelt releases in this case.
Okay, thank you. Some more boards have gone up, so we will carry on for a short while. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you very much, sir. I just wanted to express my support for the argument of the council, Mr. Reid, for the council there, and 0021 of the London plan, the adopted London plan. It says that the boroughs don't need to revisit the figures as part of their local plan development unless they have additional evidence that suggests they can achieve delivery of housing above these figures while remaining in line with the strategic policies established in this plan. Now, there was an attempt, as I mentioned yesterday, by the Mayor of London to make a power grab on Greenbelt policy. He wanted to preclude it as part of the London plan, but that was declared by the panel to be wrong and in conflict, inconsistent with national policy. The deallocation of Greenbelt land is a local matter. And Mr. Reid is quite right. That is not something that the GLA or the Mayor of London can prevent a London borough from doing if they think it is necessary to do so and they've met the requirements of national policy, including the exceptional circumstances test. And in relation to the argument that we had from the GLA yesterday, small p prematurity, my characterisation, it's probably not the right way to express it. The Mayor of London could only undertake a review of the Greenbelt and indicate where he thought Greenbelt release might need to take place, but he couldn't actually deallocate those sites. As you know, sir, from your involvement in the Places for Everyone plan, the Greater Manchester plan, that's why Andy Burnham had to do a joint plan in the end rather than a strategic development strategy. So the point is that it wouldn't be, the Mayor of London cannot limit the ability of this borough to do what it is legally able to do, which is to identify and deallocate land from the Greenbelt if it thinks it's necessary to do so in the context of national planning policy.
Thank you. Sorry, Barclay Holmes, isn't it? I can do some names because the signs are just close enough for me to read the names, and then they go beyond where my eyesight will kick in, and my reading glasses are not strong enough for that. So I do apologise. Roughly where Mr. Stevens and Mr. Byrne or Mr. West are, I can see. Beyond that, it's no.
I think they go alphabetically at that end of the table. Mr. Rowley and Mr.
So I struggle. So I beg your pardon.
No, that's right. My name is supremely unimportant. Beyond the fact I'm representing Barclay. I think just to add really to the point around the references to 0.021 and also I would add 1.4.4 that refer to the question around not revisiting the local need assessments. Those only relate to the issue of the 10-year targets up to 2029. So they expressly do not relate to the task that is ahead of this plan, which is to look for how you set a requirement for beyond 2029. The only reference we've got to that is the 4111, and then obviously that's applied within the context of national policies I mentioned earlier on.
Thank you. Mr. West?
Thank you. I wanted just very briefly to come back on Mr. Reid's point about the freedom of local authorities to develop their local plans. Obviously, that's absolutely correct, but I would just point out the requirement in the legislation is that there is general conformity with the London plan, and we have it from the GLA that aspects of the local plan are not in conformity with the London plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, sir. Just to pick up on some characterisation comments of my statement and others by Mr. Reid. You should not do anything in advance of the next London plan, is what seems to be what was this side of the table, if you like, was suggesting. I don't think that's been suggested at all. If anything, we're frustrated by this plan's slow progress, and we have put forward a very large number of sites to try and identified sites to help this council meet its housing need. So the suggestion that we are advocating not doing anything in front of the next London plan is simply not accepted, and we don't appreciate it. You mentioned about rollover. I was not advocating for rollover. I was simply filling in some gaps about how the rollover has come about. On 0.022, I don't have a prescribed view of the future. I mentioned 0.22 simply as a way to reflect on the London plan as a whole and some of the comments it makes, which are relevant, I believe, to 4.1.11. I don't take a prescribed view at all. So I just wanted to correct that, if that's okay, sir, because I did feel the characterisation of Mr. Reid, of my comments and others, was a bit unfair.
Okay, point taken. Right. Mr. West, is that a new... Have you, sorry. Oh, that's fine. Do you want to come back on?
Oh, just, as I say, I meant no disrespect to any of the parties. I think I said that. Made my submissions on that. I hear what's said and, in fact, was supportive of our case anyway, so I don't need to say anything more. But supportive, but bearing in mind, of course, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting at all that there is endorsement.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
But in those regards, the other point I would just make, sir, and I think it's right to note it, concerns the question of the approach towards in consultation, because actually the examination did deal with this issue, and the GLA gave an indication as to what it meant, and it certainly wasn't suggesting that it meant agreement with. And we can
Sorry, this is the London plan.
It's of the London plan, and we can put that in if you want to see it. It may be that you're satisfied, but it does give an indication that what they were looking to, what they meant by consultation was support and advice, rather than agreement by. It's very much.
I don't need any paper on that, I don't think, at the moment. Thank you. If I change my mind, I'll let you know. I've heard enough about
Thank you very much. And the final point would certainly note what Mr. Stevens has said and agree with it with regard to the limits of what the mayor can do as to allocating sites in the Green Belt.
Okay, thank you. Yes, 4.11, the outcome of it and the requirement figure is a multifaceted issue. It's going to come up in many times. I'm not going to get to the bottom of it today. It's I'm looking at the clock for once, and there is question 2.2, 2.4 is about the GLA advice, a lot of which was talked about yesterday. There's also then question 2.5, 2.7, which is about footnote 1 and the Hadley Wood Neighbourhood Forum, Neighbourhood Forum for Neighbourhood Requirement Figure. I don't have a huge amount of questions on that, nor do I have a lot of questions on GLA advice. So if everyone's okay, I'm prepared to carry on, and we may as well get to the end of today's session rather than have an hour break and then come back for what might not be very long. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah.
Yes. So there is one point. There is one point that arises. I don't think it matters now, but there's the name Storm that is due to come into London overnight now. It was due to come in during the day tomorrow.
Right.
It might be just worthwhile looking at that with regard to certainly your, I know in terms of your...
Yeah, well, I did see that actually the other day. I thought I'm going to be driving home right in the middle of it. Yeah. Which is not fun.
Well, quite. So anyway, so I thought I'd flag it up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we can't obviously do the... I mean, it would be nice if I could bring forward tomorrow's session, but I can't really. Because
no, I don't think I can.
It wouldn't be reasonable. There probably are people who are here, but there might be others as well.
No, certainly.
But I guess it's worth... Thank you, because it's worth pointing... If it looks like it could be problematic, then I'll obviously talk to Annette about letting people know, and we may just have to postpone that session.
Yeah.
If not only for my safety, which is obviously paramount importance, but for everybody else's safety as well.
Well, that's right.
Getting around. So
that's what we thought. As I say, we've checked, and it looks like it's coming overnight rather than
right. Okay.
Rather than during the day.
Okay, sorry, it's a good point. I'd noticed it in the week. It had slipped my mind, but I was thinking, yeah, it's yeah. Thank you. Good point. I say I don't think if obviously it's not great to postpone something late notice, but I think people understand it's going to be a relatively short session. I think,
Yeah.
and something we could probably pick up with the parties another time. I think it's obviously the SA and HRA are very important things, but they're not. Again, they're things which we can return to as we go through the process. So,
Yes.
if anybody has, I would say around, well, obviously, if anyone here today is due to come tomorrow and has concerns, then I think just raise them with either the councillor and/or Annette, and then that can be passed on to me, and I'll probably talk to Annette to see if there's any worth contact anybody else, and if obviously any of your team coming from further afield, you need to let Annette know, and we'll judge the risk of it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. It's a good point. I'd not realised. Thank you. So we'll move on then to questions 2.2, 2.4, which is about the GLA advice. Given the discussions yesterday and the hearing matter statements I've had and so on and so forth, I haven't got a huge amount to say anymore about that. GLA advice, well, I call it the GLA advice because that's what was referred to in the conformity topic paper and the statement of common ground, the original statement of common ground with the GLA when I wrote my questions, and I wanted to understand where that had come from and what its context was and so on. I've been informed through the council's hearing matter statement that it was some email advice that was provided. That email is not before me, and
Yes.
But I've had obviously GLA here to tell me what they think. Hopefully, we'll have their statement, which will set this out in more clarity. Well, as in, I've got my notes of it, but we'll have the formal statement. I can see that, so I know where they stand on that. I know from
What exactly? Are you referring
this is the state. This is the advice in the. It was referred to as updated advice relating to how councils or boroughs should address the post-2029 figure in light of changes to national policy, changing government, changing approach, that kind of thing. So, and it was suggesting, I think the suggestion was that it's back to the rollover argument or not rolling over. So we've heard a lot about that. I've heard from various parties in their statements about the weight that should be given to that. That's for me to decide. As the inspector, I am capable of coming to that conclusion, coming to a conclusion myself. So I'll start with the council. Is there anything you wish to add about this from yesterday?
No, so you now have actually updated guidance on how to approach at least the case generally, and there are inconsistencies that exist between what was set out in the GLA and the council's statement of common ground and what was stated yesterday. It doesn't actually alter any of the points that we've discussed subsequently. So.
Inconsistencies are the bread and butter of a local plan examination. And sort of thing.
Indeed,
I can wade my way through those. Does anybody else have any comments about that? For those who are aware of what I'm talking about, that advice that was given or the status, particularly for those who weren't here yesterday, who didn't comment on it yesterday. No, thank you.
Only to say that obviously that's a key piece of information. Some of what we've been discussing this morning is speculative in a way because we don't actually know what this advice is going to be. So it would be very useful to have it.
Well, I haven't had the email, but we have had the verbal, oral advice from GLA about what their position is yesterday.
Oh, that was yesterday.
Yeah, sorry. So I beg your pardon. I do. This is the problem of having some overlapping sessions, which is why obviously if anybody who's here today who's got an interest in that particular topic, then who wasn't here yesterday, then by all means raise it. But it doesn't appear like there is any need for that. So I'll move on then to questions 2.5 to 2.7, which are relating to footnote 1 in policy SS1, or rather, as it's a footnote, not in policy SS1. And the answers to, the questions arise from paragraph 67 of the framework, which states that within the overall requirement, a housing requirement for any designated neighbourhood area should also be included which reflects the strategy and pattern development set out in the plan, including relevant allocations. Footnote 1 in the policy refers to a minimum of 160 dwellings within the Hadley Wood neighbourhood area. And the council's hearing statement concludes that footnote 1 does meet the requirements of paragraph 67, insofar as it provides a figure for a designated neighbourhood area. But it is, if I've understood it correctly, the council is proposing a main modification to bring the footnote into policy. Without getting into debate for what it's worth, footnote should be in policy. If it's valid, I think there's, Mr. Reid, rather, you may have there's a relatively recent judgment, I think, in relation to whether footnotes can be seen as policy or not.
Yes, there is, but we've made the modification, and that resolves the question for our part.
It needs to be added to the schedule. I don't think I've got an updated schedule of main modifications. That might be another action for the end of the because obviously some have been put forward in hearing matters statements, which I don't think have found their way to the schedule. Fine, we can still discuss them. The figure of 160 dwellings relates to the allocation that falls within, proposed allocation that falls within that area. Won't discuss the specifics of that today. Obviously, I know Hadley Wood Neighbourhood Forum will have a view on that, and obviously you can raise any points you wish to raise now. But I don't want to get into the figure. The footnote talks about windfalls and not being able to assess what that number is, and so it's not included in the figure. So it's fair to say, I think my interpretation of the framework is that it's trying to sort of, if you've got a designated neighbourhood area, you should identify what kind of need that area has. So it's a need for that area, because it might be addressing certain deficiencies or whatever, but that's not really the case here. It's purely a reflection of the fact there's an allocation and nothing else. Yeah. So the 160 isn't. So again, just for the sake of argument, if that allocation were not in the plan, there's no. It wouldn't be. The plan wouldn't be giving a figure for that. It's not identified a particular need for that area. It's not necessarily the allocation isn't there to meet a particular need that's been identified to satisfy. Whether it be a qualitative or quantitative need, it's purely it's part of the capacity.
It is. It's part of actually the process of identifying what the figure should be for 4111 purposes.
Yeah, understood. And we touched on it yesterday. As far as you're concerned, it has no bearing on the neighbourhood plan directly.
No.
I have the proposed modification. Obviously, it can go in the schedule as is, and I know in time offer a view on it. But seems to me while we're here that. All it needs, so if I just bear with me while I pull it out. Yeah, I mean, just before it goes in the schedule, I may as well give you some views on it as I'm sitting in the room. It's far too long. It's got far too much detail in it for what is required by paragraph 67, and there's too much discursive information. This isn't relevant. I mean, the only thing it needs to say is that in the Hadley Wood designated area, the requirement is a minimum of 160 homes. It doesn't need to say anything about paragraph 67. It doesn't really need to say anything about windfalls. It doesn't need to say when the neighbourhood plan was adopted, so on and so forth. And this may be a little note for how we may, when we come on to some of the other policies in the plan, how they've been written. Yeah, there's a propensity for verbosity when none is needed. So.
Let's make sure that everything's covered. Would I take that point?
So I think I would suggest before the schedule finds a way, you could have that could be looked at again. But that's. But I do think a main modification, the number notwithstanding, a footnote should be removed and it should be in policy. So that's I've got to say on that. Yeah, that's the other point. So I have no other points on that. Would you like to raise any comments?
Yeah, thank you. What's not clear to us in this sort of statement is that we do know what windfall sites are being delivered, and we've already delivered over 80 units out of that 160 between 2019 and spring 24. We know there's planning applications in for another 8 units. We know there's been another permission granted for 7 units, additional units. So our issue is we're going to meet this 160 through windfall developments way before the end of the local plan period. And if this 160 stays and we carry on delivering, we have an issue locally that we just don't have the services or the infrastructure that is going to get way overloaded. It just can't cope. We are quite an isolated site. It is poorly accessible. It's only purely car dependent. And we're delivering these units, you know, for the council and for everyone to live in. But there comes a point when you're over-delivering, there's just no services to cope with, and we'll end up, you know, we'll have a big issue locally because there are no planned infrastructure improvements at all in Hadley Wood.
Okay, thank you. That'll obviously, again, there's never the end of this, so this will come up when we'll have an opportunity to, I think, we'll go into more detail on that when we get to very awkward titles for these allocations. RUR.02. Raw 02. I don't know. I'll come up with a way of saying it by the time we get there. Are you? I mean, obviously, purely in terms of what SS2 would say, which is as of now it would say 160 minimum of 160 dwellings. So I guess what you're saying is that, well, actually, you can meet that requirement. And this again, I think this will put a pin in this because I think you'll come back to it. But you can deliver that without an allocation, and therefore you could, in theory, meet SS1 without the allocation. And so this is the kind of point I was making about, again, the norm, if outside London, is, okay, this area needs X houses to meet some kind of issue, and then it can be back. This is not quite what I'm being told here. It's purely 160 because of the allocation, and so any windfall is above that, and it is a minimum 160 above that. But you're saying, well, actually, if it's about meeting some kind of need, we could do that without the allocations.
We're going to do that way before the end of the plan period and over-deliver probably on the 160, given the trajectory that we've done so far in the last 5 years.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Any comment on you?
I think from our perspective, any windfall that would occur in Hadley would contribute to the overall windfall figure already accounted for in the plan, if that makes sense. So I think you would be double counting to suggest that would impact on the 160 figure, because to meet the overall housing target, we need to have the full windfall supply across the entire borough in addition to allocations.
Well, I don't think it would be double counting because the windfall, you might count it in 2 places, as in there'd be the windfalls equating to the 160, meeting the 160 dwellings requirement for the Hadley Wood area, and that would be in your monitor report, and then you'll have an overall overall delivery for the borough as a whole, but that wouldn't be what's being delivered in Hadley Wood would be subsumed within the overall figure. It wouldn't be in addition to the overall figure, would it? So I don't think it would be double counting. But I take the point I think you're trying to make.
The point, I think, is that within the 353 dwellings per annum, which we're expecting, or 281, however you want to put it, that would factor in windfalls in Hadley Wood.
Yeah. I think, well, it comes back to this point, I think, that, as I say, we're not dealing with a normal or typical situation where the number has been identified purely in relation to a need. This is more reflecting a fact, and that throws up slightly different issues. But again, I'm aware of those, so I think we can, again, as I keep saying, that's the thread. By the time we get to the end of this process, those threads will be tied together, and I'll be able to understand the big picture and see what comes out of the issue. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, sir. It just reminded me, are we going to talk about windfall in more detail somewhere? Because it'd be helpful if large windfall and small windfall were split out in some way, because it was a real task to work that out. And it's hard to see where they're getting them, where they're expecting them to come from. Because we can see in the Hella, for example, that there's a lot of large sites which aren't allocated, and presumably they're in the windfall. So it'd be useful, I think, to have that.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, as I say, I saw this session really, and these sessions as being, as say, kind of points at which there might be a divergence, if you like, of where we go in terms of discussions. And some things will be things I can come to a categoric position on before stage 2. Some things I won't. Clearly, we're at this first part of this discussion, which is what is the principle of how we've gone about coming up with a requirement. Then we've got to get into the, okay, well, if that principle is acceptable and doesn't need anything at work, then we need to look at the components of that in detail, plus, of course, the 5-year supply and everything else. So I think that's where we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty, as I say, of windfall allowances and how they've been determined and whether they can be justified, alongside the capacity assessments. Again, is that what the council would be expecting?
Yes, so I think we were expecting it would come up, at least in part, under questions 4.6 through to 4.8, which deals with whether there's a quantitative need to remove land from the green belt.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I mean, obviously in a principle matter, but whether we I'm anticipating going line by line again. I mean, windfall's slightly different, but you can obviously, yes, if there's an overarching argument as to the windfall allowance, then fine, if it's a logical place to do it. If at any point I need to go, delve into those figures and in delving into the deliverable, developable supply.
Well, quite so. I think that there is obviously a danger of just in the 4.6 through to 4.8 going into analysis of each and every site and asking what are the particular parameters around those sites with regard to, say, availability or deliverability or the quantum of provision that will bog down the overarching questions for you, which are, in general terms, has enough been done to satisfy the requirement for release of the greenbelt. So there needs to be some degree of tempering, I think, of how much we should go into it at 4.6 through to 4.8 as opposed to stage 2, when those will be looked at in much more detail.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not going to stop people saying what they want to say, but there's always going to be a scope. I mean, I haven't got before me, I don't think, every single site that's been considered. I may have through the IIA, I don't know, possibly, but in that form, that I would want to examine it on that basis. So I think it is going to be something we come back to. But again, if there's some in principle issue, i.e., just to say we've missed an entire ward in our assessment, and so we say we've missed an entire area, then that might be something we address. But if it's sort of we disagree about this individual site, then I think that's something I just need to take into account as it's a bit like site selection issues, isn't it? Is this a disagreement in judgment over one site which we can pick up at a later date, or is this some kind of systemic issue which affects and contaminates the entire process? And I think that's what next week's going to be about, in my mind. It's looking at process and approach and so on, and using examples, perhaps, of that. But I'm not anticipating getting into a line-by-line, site-by-site debate, because I think that can come later.
That's the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think that. Is there any other points anybody wishes to make on anything that's been raised today?
Not for the council, thank you.
Anybody? Anyone? No? Mr. Byrne.
Sorry to labour this, but we mentioned the AI point earlier in the council's just slightly changed position. I don't really understand how they could have got to that position. I'm sorry to bring this up again, but are they saying they haven't used any kind of automated software at all? And those summaries were written by humans, because it just doesn't make sense in terms of the testing of them. The responses by the council, yes. The summaries, no. And it does matter, and it's going to come up tomorrow. Sorry.
Right. Well, the council can be forewarned, I think, on getting an answer to that. And then if it comes up, I want it, if it's going to be discussed, I want it to be discussed in the context of some soundness or legal compliance issue, not a kind of we would have preferred it if it had been done differently. You know, it's got to have a consequence, I think, to this. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So
I don't want to necessarily, in the abstract, wouldn't it be better if they didn't use AI? I mean, bearing in mind what the most recent guidance from PINS is about AI, it's useful to know. I've been given an answer. I'm going to take that answer. But yeah, it's got to have a consequence other than, I think, we don't agree with this, or we'd prefer it if they'd done another way. I've got to know, well, how has it affected the outcome? And that's, I think, let's look at the issues then.
Understood, and that's why I was bringing it up, because that is exactly what we think we're raising tomorrow. Okay. Exactly that, a point where it actually has affected us.
Okay, thank
you. Obviously, I don't want to start going into the debate at this stage, but if there are, so we know what we're supposed to be searching for, rather than us having to go through a whole range of different issues. Is there anything that Mr. Byrne can tell us as to what he's going to be raising? Because I don't think he's raised it until now. I don't make any criticism about that at all. And if I've missed it, forgive me. But it would just be helpful so we know what we should be searching.
By the by, you can have that discussion outside the scope of this. I don't, I can hear it tomorrow once, because obviously if you can sort things out, and this is just a general rule of thumb, if outside this room you can sort things out amongst yourselves, and and then please do so, because it saves me time. So it's perfectly legitimate for you to have a conversation about this outside, and if you can satisfy yourselves as to where you are, then you can report back to me tomorrow, than rather me listening to it now. That's all right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So are there any, final, any other points? If not, I again thank you all for your time today. I say this is a step along a long path where we'll be picking some of these things up again. So don't feel for anything that we've with the end of any debate. I do appreciate everyone's comments and time. Obviously, thank you for the council reminding me about the weather situation. We'll look into that, and if anyone wants to raise anything with the net, please do. And then we will try to. Obviously, if anything does change tomorrow, we'll try and give everyone reasonable amount of notice, notwithstanding how often the weather apps are changing and things as well. So, again, appreciate it. And assuming everything goes to plan, I will adjourn today, and we'll start again at 9:30 in the morning. Thank you very much. Thank you.